tetragrammaton.
We are harming those kids. We're harming their brains. They're becoming poor doctors. I know that.
Well, I agree there.
And the issue is you have to understand where we went off the rails. And I think when you hear the story that we're going to talk about today, because I've never told this story to anyone in total, they've heard bits and pieces of it. I don't know if Rick shared with you the 3 blogs that I wrote. I wrote them because Rick said to me, give me an idea. And instead, something else happened to me. I decided to lay all the cards on the table. So I posted those 3 blogs, and people have read them, and they're fucking stunned. And I'm like, that is the level of detail that you have to go to. And when you understand how important this is, because I don't think you're going to understand the implications as the story is being laid out. But at the end, then I think some of the things that you've said on social media or in your podcast, you will understand why they aggravate the shit out of me.
Good. No, because that's what I want. I mean, look, to be quite direct, like the opportunity to sit down and chat with you and Rick directly is amazing, because more and more and more, everything to me seems to center back to good circadian behavior.
Absolutely.
And I do realize that that's just the tip of the... Yeah, so I think that where modern biology and medicine is, and the sorts of things that I talk about, you know, getting your morning sunlight, avoiding blue light at night. I mean, I do realize, you know, that's 0.5% of what there is to know. And I'm hoping that today you can also educate me a bit on how gene expression is controlled by light. I'm fascinated and totally on board with what I've heard you say about the fact that the way that all the base pairs in DNA and the way that amino acids like tryptophan and tyrosine, which are the precursors to serotonin and dopamine, and all of that is occurring within the action spectra of sunlight. I'd also love to learn from you about how changes in ozone are changing.
Did you read 29?
I did.
Did you like the whole story from the beginning? Because when you see it, then you begin to go. Because the one thing that you and I think are going to resonate a lot about, Rick already knows this part of it, but the eureka moment for me was the leptin melanocortin pathway. I wrote a blog 15 years ago that I got pretty famous on the internet about. It's called CT7. It's called Cold Thermogenesis 7. And you know, Rick's a big believer in cold. You know, he's a big believer in most of the things that I teach. But I need you to understand where CT6 came from. The story and how it all began. I wrote 27, Quantum Engineering 27, 28 for you. I wrote 29 for him. And the reason why is because I owe him an explanation for certain things. And you know, you probably know a little bit more about Rick than I do, but you know, Rick had his own little health issue, and he promised me when we came out here, we were going to talk about that. But I don't want to start with Rick. I want to start with you. Why? You need a measuring stick. Nature is my measuring stick. You believe, as a PhD researcher, in randomized controlled clinical trials. I'm a doctor. I signed a Hippocratic Oath. I can do no harm. I take that to heart. My randomized controlled clinical trial is the KT event that happened 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs got taken out and our clade, all of us in this room, the guys in the engineering room, my nurse sitting over there, are all mammals. You need to understand that story. So where did the story begin? For you, there was a book written in 1923 by a Russian researcher named Alexander Gurevich, and he did a really cool experiment that everybody can do in 3rd grade. It's like, you know, what you wrote in the beginner's mindset. He cut an onion in half and he put it in between glass. And what he found out is that when he took the glass away and then put quartz in, he was able to stimulate mitosis in the cut side. So that meant that he knew, he called this mitogenic radiation. That was the name in the paper. And his name was Alexander Gurwitch, 1923. And I remember reading that paper, and I will tell you why I came to read that paper from the story that the leptin prescription is based on. So 2000, I forget when it was. It was early, 2004, 2005. I'm at a orthopedic neurosurgery meeting in Birmingham, Alabama.
Even before that, you are a practicing neurosurgeon. How many surgeries have you done over the course of your life?
Over 10,000.
Okay, so you've done 10,000 surgeries and you have an epiphany.
I wouldn't say I had the epiphany. It's kind of, this is, you know, how you like to call these collateral damages that are happy accidents.
Yeah.
I think Sheryl Crow wrote a song about that, if I'm not mistaken. But this is kind of what happened. At the time, I had come through residency. Chantal has been with me pretty much the whole time I was a resident. So she knows a lot of this story. I was an All-American baseball player and football player, phenomenal shape. Got to be 4 or 5 years after my residency, 360 pounds. So I went to my best primary care doctor who sent me the most business, who I made the most money from. And I said, Scott, tell me how to lose weight. So he gave me the standard answer that you get from most of your podcast people. You know, exercise more and eat less calories. So I did that. I gained 30 more freaking pounds. So, you know, there's a pretty famous guy that you're probably going to hear us talk about a couple of times more, Einstein. And he said, if you keep doing the same shit over and over again, it's called, and expect a different result, it's insanity. So I had done this multiple times. I did what the centralized prescription said to do, and it didn't work. Then the happy accident happened in Birmingham. So I get up to give a talk. I developed some instruments for minimally invasive spine surgery that everybody was excited about. And I was up there talking. I stood up to get to the podium, and all of a sudden I got horrible pain in my right leg. That's all I did was stand up. Turned out I was fortunate. There was some ortho guys there. They examined me. They said, look, we think you got a bucket handle tear in your knee, and that's why you need help. So to drive home from Birmingham back to Nashville, where I was practicing at the time, I actually had to call one of my friends to meet me at a place in Tennessee just so I could take a piss because I couldn't get out of my car. That's how bad it was. So I get home and I'm kind of stunned. One of the orthopedic surgeon's wives calls me up and she goes, look, my husband says you're a really smart guy. She goes, I want to share some with you. She goes, I'm going to send you 6 papers and a book. She goes, I'm going to tell you exactly the order I want you to read these in. She goes, but I think I can help you solve
What's
this
her
problem.
background? Why did she know this stuff?
I guess I can talk about this now. This is a little bit, you know, dicey. She happened to be an executive with Qualcomm. She also has a track history with a company you may know, Amgen. And Amgen at the time, the papers were all tied to leptin and leptin biology.
They eventually held the patent, right?
Right, they did. And they canceled the synthetic leptin trials. So I'm going to tell you TLDR. What was she trying to get me to understand? The reason I was a fat ass, that if I could take synthetic leptin as a drug, that I could lose the weight really fast and that'd be it. And then she also told me that after they canceled the trial, they also then patented all the cold receptors that were out there. But that wasn't the interesting thing. She was trying to lead me down a path for me to blow up centralized medicine. But here was the craziest part of the story. She sent me a book. You know what the name of the book was? The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, written by Robin Sharma. You know anything about the book?
I've heard of it.
Okay, so Julian Battle, Jewish lawyer from New York, vested in the business. And this is a fable, just so we're clear. This is not a true story. She told me to make sure that I read the book first before I read the papers. So I read the book, and here's the TLDR on the book. Julian Battle has a heart attack in court, okay? He's a boisterous, loudmouth New Yorker who, you know, kicks ass and takes names. No one really likes him, but everybody knows he's really good at his job. He has the heart attack. He quits, sells his Ferrari, moves to the Himalaya mountains, comes back a year later, tan, 100 pounds less, nice guy. Everybody likes him. And, Robin Sharma's trying to give you the, touchy feelies all the way through. That's the TLDR of the book. So I read this and totally miss why she sent me everything. I thought, instead of uncovering what Qualcomm and Amgen were really doing, she wanted me to figure out, is the book possible? Is what's in the book possible from a neurologic standpoint? Is she trying to tell me that I actually may be able to fix myself if I look at this a different way? So I started taking the book, the same thing I just showed with Rick before you came. I took the book and started writing all my ideas in the book. And these were disparate. You need to know a little bit about my background to understand where I came from. I'm from New York City. I spent my entire childhood either playing baseball, football, street hockey, or in the Museum of Natural History. I had no money. I was a poor kid. My parents were separated. My mom was on welfare for most of the time I was coming up. And I used to tail around with all the ladies who rich kids from Fifth Avenue would pay for to learn all the things. So I have an incredible educational background in a lot of different areas. I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. That's the truth. So I write all these things down in the book. And I go on a trip with my family, my son, my daughter, my ex-wife, and me. And at the time, I'm still 360 pounds. I go see the orthopedic surgeon. He tells me, look, you need to have the surgery to have this done, this and that. But I know he's full of shit because I know what the studies say about the knee surgery. I said, I'm going to put this off until I figure out how I can lose the weight. So I'm at the foot of Michelangelo's David in Florence. All this is floating in my head all at once. And I step to the foot of David and look up at his ass and then look down at me. And I said, that 500 years ago was perfection. I'm a modern human who's supposed to have all this progress and knowledge, and I'm suboptimal. What's the difference? And when I looked up, I'm certain you've been there. I don't know if you've been to see David. It's in a dome. There's a big, nice marble cornice all the way around. And on the cornice is a bird. And the sunlight was coming in and hit David right in his chest. And I looked up. And that moment it clicked. I was like, wait a minute. The big difference is the light 500 years ago. And David's a mammal. The bird's a mammal. The bird comes from theropod dinosaur. What's the connection between theropod dinosaurs and mammals? Turns out those are the two animals that got through the last extinction event 65 million years ago. What was the other key between those two animals? They have melanin on the surface, don't they? Furry little creatures we came from on our skin and hair, and theropod dinosaurs were famous because they were flying. Archaeopteryx being the first dinosaur I ever learned about at the Museum of Natural History. So I thought about it more, and then I thought about the monk who sold us Ferrari. I said, I know India was a continent that used to be where Antarctica was. It came up and crashed in to Asia, created the Himalaya mountains. I know when you go up, you get more UV light. That would explain why he was tan. And it's cold as shit up there. And I was like, cold thing doesn't matter. Then I started thinking about what I learned from NASA and the Sherpas. Sherpas take 200-300 pounds of stuff, put it on their back, these little guys, and they triple their body weight when the Europeans and the Americans can't do, and they pay them. And I knew that NASA had studied them and found out that they kind of have superhuman strength. In fact, when they up on the mountain, one of the things that's interesting, do you know what they eat to power themselves? Grass-fed butter. That's it.
Ghee?
Yeah, butter. They eat sticks of butter while they're going up. And I'm going, ketosis, tan, cold. All these thermodynamic givens are in there. And I'm thinking about the book, thinking about Julian Battle. So at the foot of David, I realized there had to be a pathway in humans. In fact, in every single mammal. So you'll like this part. I go back to Vanderbilt Medical School Library, and I don't open up books of the day, the early 2000s. I go back and open up neurosurgery textbooks from 50, 70, 80 years ago, looking for a pathway somewhere where sun would hit us that could explain these effects. Because I certainly didn't learn them in medical school at LSU, and I didn't learn them in residency at LSU. And lo and behold, one of the papers that she mentioned about leptin, I was like, man, leptin came around. It was discovered in Rockefeller University in 1994. I said, that's after I even went to medical school. So that explained why I didn't know about it.
I think it's with Jeffrey Friedman's lab.
Correct. Yep. Exactly. And when I found that out, then I realized that there was a pathway. That's when I fast forward to the new neurosurgery books. And these were brand new at the time because not a lot of work was done on them. That's when I realized that leptin was connected to the melanocortin pathway. And then I knew right away, because being a neurosurgeon, you learn about POMC. POMC is a chemical that has 6 different things in it. I use the analogy like New York. It's a deli slicer, cuts it into 6 things, and those 6 things are important. Turns out one of the things that are in there is alpha MSH. Alpha MSH is the reason you have a tan.
Malarian stimulating hormone.
Correct. Alpha MSH was big. So I was like, that's the part. The biggest part of the story is I started to realize, okay, how do we assimilate light? So one of the things in neurosurgery that always confounded me in my training, we never learned. We know about the SCN, suprachiasmatic nucleus, but we didn't learn that much about circadian biology at all. And I started to realize there were certain things I was taught in medical school that I knew were bullshit. Place that I went to medical school, you may know this guy very well, Nicholas Bazan.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Nicholas Bazan and he taught me in medical school.
I never thought I'd hear that name again.
Yeah.
And not because he isn't interesting. He's very interesting, but yeah, we've met. We've spent time talking science.
Well, he was very influential in my training. And from him, I knew one of the things that was a falsehood in ophthalmology was that the anterior chamber of the eye totally block UV light. Every doctor in every medical school today still learns that, and it's not true. And how do we know it's not true? From Bazan's work, when he was in Argentina, he radiated cow eyes, and he was able to find that UV light got through. So I asked myself the question, tan, what's tan in the eye? The RPE, the retinal pigmentum epithelium. That's where melanin is. And guess what RPE does? It rotates as light hits it, the same way chlorophyll does in a leaf.
Yeah, the RPE supplies pigment so that your photoreceptors can absorb light. It's a super dynamic structure. I didn't know it rotates, but that's a...
Correct.
Yeah.
So what the other thing that happens, if you know where it is in the retina, you have all these mitochondria. And then you have these weird cells behind the retina called Mueller cells. Mueller cells are like fiber optic cables that go straight to the midbrain. I'm like, I never learned anything about cells in neurosurgery residency, but I looked at the end part. I was thinking about light. I said, what's the target? Everything they targeted had melanin in it. And I started to go, that's weird. All the pieces come together, and I began to realize what the effect of cold was. Why? Because I have a pretty big understanding of biochemistry. And I said, in medical school, we talked about macros. That's what you guys mostly talk about on your podcast. And you know that I can't stand that. Because I
get that sense from Twitter, but
right.
But I also get the sense that you're willing to sit here and talk to me nonetheless.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah. Welcome to the House of Macadamias. Macadamias are a delicious superfood, sustainably sourced directly from farmers. Macadamias, a rare source of omega-7, linked to collagen regeneration, enhanced weight management, and better fat metabolism. Macadamias, heart healthy and brain boosting fats. Macadamias, paleo-friendly, keto and plant-based. Macadamias, no wheat, no dairy, no gluten, no GMOs, no preservatives, no palm oil, no added sugar. House of Macadamias. Rye roasted with Namibian sea salt, cracked black pepper, and chocolate dipped. Snack bars come in chocolate, coconut white chocolate, and blueberry white chocolate. Place an order today at houseofmacadamias.com.
The input to mitochondria is electron chain transport. The output is actually the way protons go. So I realized at this eureka moment that I didn't know shit about electrons and protons because I didn't learn about that in medical school. You know, I was not a quantum physicist, but guess what happened in the 18 months? The 18 months after this event, I realized that everything I learned in medical school or everything in my life, 40 years before that, was a lie. So when you think about what Rick has written in his book, I had to suspend the belief, like as you sit next to me right now, I know everything you believe and I know why you believe it because I was there. That 18 months of my life was the hardest 18 months ever. And even talking about now gets me emotional.
Can I ask you a quick question? You're talking about melanin and other molecules in the pathway that absorbs light.
Correct.
And I think some people might not realize that, you know, basically dark stuff absorbs light and lighter stuff reflects it, generally speaking, right?
Well, I mean, if you remember the Twitter issue that I had with you.
Which one?
Well, there's a couple of them, but the one that I want to focus, like in the podcast, because I know you have a lot of listeners. I want you to understand this. I use this specifically because I knew we were going to talk. Carbon. We are carbon-based semiconductor. That's what we are. And we're going to talk about where this idea came from because I want to share with you how the evolution came. But a diamond actually can be a semiconductor. You may not know that in Silicon Valley, but it has a band gap of 5.4 electron volts. In fact, if you use carbon as a diamond instead of silicon, you can shrink it down even further. The problem is diamonds are really expensive, so that's the reason they're not in your Intel processors. But it's a phenomenal issue. The thing that Silicon Valley is at right now, they are at a band gap level. They're looking at graphene. Graphene, you know, is carbon, right? But it's a special format of carbon. What we are a special, all three of us are carbon-based, triple helix, hydrated, different. And that's what makes this really hard for, and I don't want to say a guy like you. If I use that term in this podcast, I want you to know that I'm also talking about me 20 years ago.
Great. No, I get it. And
Anyone who went to medical school.
Correct. Or anybody who teaches people that go to medical school, because you know what? I view him, and I'm saying Mr. Huberman,
Yes.
he's teaching the future.
Yes.
If I want to be the seed of change, dude, you're going to see the trees. And you're going to get the shade of those trees.
Yes.
And I want you to know that you can take what I found and change and tweak and say, maybe we need to start asking some better questions in and around this light thing. Because this light story is huge. Mm-hmm. I want to explain to you how huge it is, because this hits your expertise.
Well, and this is why I'm here, to learn and to engage neuroplasticity.
That's exactly what this is.
So I have a question. Maybe we'll get back to it later, but there's this idea currently, the one that I was taught, that certain cells in the eye, we'll talk about skin, but they absorb light and then transduce that light into electrical and chemical signals, and it's handed off from one neuron to the next in the eye and then into the brain. I'm going to just go out on a limb here and ask, do you think it's possible that light itself is actually being transmitted past the eye into the brain, not just, light being turned into electrical and chemical signals and passed into the brain? Because we know that happens in birds.
I already gave you the answer, but you
it's those Mueller. No, I wasn't. Wait. Hold on. No. That I won't take. The Mueller cells. So the reason I'm asking is because those Mueller cells, you're talking about fiber optic cables.
Correct.
Here unfortunately he's dead now, but my postdoc advisor, Ben Barris, really popularized to some extent the exploration of glia, Mueller glial cells.
Correct.
Before Ben, there were a number of people walking around saying glia do a lot more than just support the neurons. They're not just glue. Glia literally translates to glue in Latin. And we can really look at, Ben's contribution as getting people to wake up to the reality, which is that glia do much, much more than that. So I am open to the idea that light could actually be transmitted through these Mueller glia.
Well,
I just want to make sure that I was understanding that implication
you're perfectly
correctly.
right, but we're going to do a lot of time travel in this podcast.
Okay.
I told you the story about Gurwitch. Now we need to come back to it because this is important.
So we're back to 1923.
Back to 1923. So from Gurwitch all the way up to the 1960s, the story of light was lost in biology. You know that because of vitality versus reductionism. We come from a field of reductionists. We believe about randomized controlled clinical trials. There are some interesting developments that happened in quantum biology. 1927, a Nazi wrote the first paper about quantum biology. Okay. His name, I think, was Jakob. In fact, I put one of the pictures in the blog that I wrote for you, a timeline for you to follow so you can go back and read those papers. It was not well received, even though it was between World War I and World War II. But guess who wrote the follow-up paper? Niels Bohr, 1929.
I thought you were going to say Hitler.
No. Niels Bohr in 1929. And then the Nazi scientists wrote another paper in 1932 when things were coming on. But where did the shit hit the fan with this story with Gurwitch? Because Bohr weighed in early on in the 20th century. This is when biochemistry was formative, quantum mechanics was formative. A guy that I know both of you have heard, Erwin Schrödinger, wrote a book called What is Life? This is the first time where a physicist got interested in biology. And the TLDR of that book, okay, you don't need to go and read it. He came up with a term called negative entropy. The reason I mention this to you is because the only thing I disagree with you in your book is actually tied to this concept. So that's why I want to focus on it for you.
Great.
But basically what he said, Andrew, is that it seems when you look at everything that's alive, not just animal cells, even plant cells, everything seems to follow negative entropy. We seem to break the second law of thermodynamics. And and I know you've heard this, I'm not saying that you know the story, but Alfred Eddington, who basically gave the Nobel Prize to Einstein, he went to a forest to take pictures of the perihelion of Mercury and proved that the theory of relativity was in fact true during the war, okay? And he famously said, it's published in literature, anything that contravenes or contravenes the second law of thermodynamics is pseudoscience. That is still true to this day. But Schrödinger was the first physicist that realized that there is something that life is doing that is creating a negative entropy state. Let me define entropy because I want you to see my prism, how I understand this, because you've used that word several times in your book. Everything in the universe to a physicist ends in heat death. In other words, everything goes from order to disorder. That's how, if you followed the Big Bang's logic, we're going to end in heat death. But we know that's not true. We've got some famous physicists we'll talk about later in this story who came up with ideas called dissipative structures. He won a Nobel Prize for it. His name is Ilya Prigogine. And it turns out cells are dissipative structures. But the story is more important for you to get. I want you to be more than directionally accurate. I want you to understand this perspective. So negative entropy means there is some way that cells are able to slow down time. Because what are clocks? Now, this is very germane to what we talked about earlier. Circadian clocks, molecular clocks, the clocks that are in front of every gene, they are flow meters for entropy. That's effectively what they are. So they are measuring time. And in quantum mechanics, when you hear Niels Bohr talk, anything you measure, it kind of screws everything up, okay? That's where you get the uncertainty principle and all that. So here I am back before, in that 18 months, all the things that we're all three of us are talking about right now, this is the soup in my head. Before you came, Rick and I were talking about soup and chili. Sometimes soup and chili has to stay around a while before you really get its flavor. And that 18 months, as much as it pissed me off, to this day, it still pisses me off. I began to realize there was a side of science that I missed. And the single most important thing, because I didn't forget your question, was that onion experiment. And that onion experiment led to a physicist in the 60s named Fritz Popp. You want to write that name down. Fritz Popp basically looked at what Gurwitz found. And remember, at that time, we had no way to measure light coming from an onion. But guess what happened in Popp's lifetime? He built machines that could do that. They're called photomultipliers. Photomultipliers can take a leaf, just like you have here, Rick, outside, and you can put it underneath there. And if you look at the blogs that I wrote for you, gentlemen, I showed you pictures of living things, flowers, and you can see the emission. You asked me a question about the light. I'm telling you, the key to this story is the light that we create inside. Now, you're probably going to see the quantum leap that happened for me at Michelangelo's statue. I realized that I needed to learn more about physics because of mitochondria, electrons and protons. So that meant I also needed to learn a lot more about light. In that 18 months, Andrew, I jumped down a rabbit hole that you can't imagine. It was mostly physics. I became an expert in physics very, very quickly, but it was an expert in the physics that was tied to our surfaces, eyes, skin, and gut. And what did I find there? And I know you know this. POMC is created by light at all of those levels. That's the chemical that's made out of the 6 different things. One of them you're going to love. We might as well give you this one now. The chemical that's cleaved right before alpha MSH is beta endorphin. So nature built us to be addicted to the sun. Why? Because the story I'm unfolding for you right now, we cannot remain healthy without the sun. And centralized medicine, Andrew, you know, ophthalmology and dermatology are adamant that the sun is toxic for us. In fact, people at your institution have come out on other podcasts and said, if you have a tan, Rick, right now, if you have a tan, you're a bad boy. You're trying to harm yourself. That is absolutely false. That is completely false. And anybody who says that on a podcast, I want to rip their vocal cords out. I do.
There is this idea in modern ophthalmology that I would think you would like, which is that they are clinical trials, mainly done in China, but elsewhere as well, that kids that spend 2 hours or more outside each day have a far lower incidence of myopia and nearsightedness than
I've written
children
blogs
that
about
don't.
it.
Yeah, so I think, I'm hoping that the modern field of ophthalmology is starting to come around on the idea that light is bad for our skin and eyes. Clearly, it's key. I just want to touch on a statement you made earlier. I'm sure we'll come back to it, but this idea that we are generating light inside of us, that our cells can generate new light.
I wrote the same thing down.
So this is interesting because I can think of three possibilities. The first one I already know is false based on talking to you, which is that light activates a subset of cells that are able to access light in the eye, in the skin, and then the rest is just electrical and chemical signaling, and that the inside of us is completely dark. Okay, that I'm assuming we agree that's wrong. 2, that sunlight itself is being passed through lenses and filters into the depths of our body. 3,
Partially true.
partially true. Okay, and then 3, that sunlight is activating cells on our surface that then is transduced in ways that allow other cells within us to generate new light.
Correct. That is absolutely correct.
Okay, so 2 and 3 are correct. Number 1
Correct.
is false. Okay, great.
So the story continues on. Fritz Popp does the photomultipliers. Now we know for sure that every cell that's alive on this planet emits something called ultra weak UV light. Okay. What does that mean? Now I'm taking you to science today, 2023. What do we know from physics? We know that every cell emits it, but it's very, very interesting. We don't know the spectrum. Why? Because we don't have a photomultiplier that can measure it that low. So that's something technology, like if you have friends in Silicon Valley, because this is big. This is big for me. It's not going to stop me, but we need to know this.
So you said every cell can generate ultra weak UV light.
Correct.
And is that the same as heat?
Well, remember, UV light can be turned into heat when light hits matter. Remember, there's no heat until you hit matter. So here's where it gets very important for you, Andrew. Once you know that, then you have to start asking yourself a question. And I'm trying to take you to the disbelief in the questions that I had, because I know you're going to have them.
I don't think we're going to disagree as much as...
I'm going to give you the answer, though, because I'm going to tell you how it happens. If you look at 2 and 3, you're going to come up with the answer. I gave it to you in the blog. It's wideband semiconduction. And it turns out I didn't learn about that until probably the back half of the 18 months. And what makes wideband semiconducting interesting, and this is where you're going to get pretty horny as a biologist. Has it ever struck you that when you look at the periodic table of elements, that we only use from atoms 1 through 53? And in atoms 1 through 53, we don't use any of the certain of those atoms, and we use a shit ton of others. Did it ever strike you as a pattern? You know better than anybody that our brain picks up patterns. This is the pattern I picked up. Magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen. They're all in group 2, 3, and 4 on the periodic table. And you know what? The key proteins, which we're going to get to, they all had characteristics, okay?
So magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, and nitrogen.
Yeah, look at a periodic table. Like
elements that we use.
When we get done doing this first time, I hope that we have an opportunity. I want to show you guys the blogs. I got my computer here. I want to show you the pictures I put in here, because I'm going to tell you something. The story I'm laying out for you, this is really important for you to hear. The physics that's important for biology is AMO physics. What does that mean? Atomic molecular organization. So when I realized that this light pathway coming through the pupil as a perfect black box radiator was hitting the RPE, and the RPE was doing something that light, its target was leptin in the hypothalamus. And then its target was every place where melanin was inside. And I thought about something that was really unusual. I said, birds have almost all their melanin in their feathers. And theropod dinosaurs got through this extinction event. I said, what was the common tie that got them together? And you'll appreciate this, because this is the biology angle. They had their mitochondrial capacity buried to fly. Why? Because they have to disconnect from the earth and fly. How did they survive a block in photosynthesis? They flew to where the food was. The mitochondrial capacity allowed them to do that. Why did mammals survive this event? They were underneath the ground. They were small. All their melanin was in their skin. You know why but it was our ancestors. Why we were small? Do you know that melanin, when UV light hits it, fluoresces so that the dinosaurs would see it and they would eat them? How do we know that? Museum of Natural History taught me that theropod dinosaurs are exactly the same. Their hip joints are the same. And we know that birds can see UV light. So that meant dinosaurs could too. So we stayed small. What is the key event that happened? I want to take you now back to the KT event. You don't have to know a lot, but things that got us to this point. Step back. The planet's 4.6 billion years old. Life is on the planet 3.8 billion years, 2 domains, archaea and bacteria. We go all the way through. Those 2 domains to this very day are pretty much unchanged. Not a big deal. Why didn't they innovate? Well, it turns out the ionosphere, or the atmosphere of Earth, had to change. We used to be a reducing atmosphere filled with carbon dioxide and methane. What do you listen to the freaks that are in the World Economic Forum today tell you about? Gases. Makes the Earth hot, right? Well, we know that it was really, really hot. Part of the reason why bacteria and archaea didn't do much is the thermodynamic givens of the planet for 2.7 billion of those 3.8 billion years sucked. Okay? What changed it? The Great Oxidation Event. You learned about that, I know, in your training. What happened in the Great Oxidation Event? one bacteria, cyanobacteria, shows up on Earth, basically takes all the methane out, buries it in below the ground in permafrost. But here's the key event. This is the part you're going to like about why you do CT. When you replace those gases, the greenhouse gases, with oxygen and nitrogen, remember, our atmosphere today is filled with 71% nitrogen, 22%, 21% oxygen. Oxygen makes it cold, changes what happens in a season and a day, depending on the latitude you're at. So this has been imprinted through the great oxidation event through every cell. That's where all your enzymes and mitochondria come from. It's affected all the heme-based proteins. Everything in life has been affected by this outside in. So we're continuing to go on the story. You know, the story of Lynn Margulis, the wife of Carl Sagan. She's the one that came up with the theory of endosymbiosis, that at one time, how we got chloroplast and mitochondria, this bacteria and archaea got together, and then we made a new domain, the domain that we're from, eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have a nucleus and a big cytoplasm, and we got complex life from there. Why do I think Darwin was an idiot? Not because his idea wasn't good. It didn't go far enough.
What Jack's saying is basically cells ate other cells, and then we basically have all our eukaryotic cells, like because we're eukaryotes, basically are cells that gulped other cells. So like when we think of a single cell, the idea is that the little bits inside of the organelles, like the mitochondria and the Golgi apparatus and all the things that do things within our cells, used to be separate cells, but they were like gobbled up. And now what we think of as a cell is actually cells that ate other cells. And that's true. There's no disputing that.
And what happened, interestingly enough, we deleted the genes in the part that became the nucleus. We believe there's still a fight in science that the nucleus is an archaea, but we now have 37 genes in a mitochondria. Only 13 of them, the 13 key ones, are the ones that make all the cytochrome proteins.
This is sort of like if a person ate another person, and then we call that two-bodied thing one person. Like it would go around and the inner voice would be like, hey, like you should do this. You know, that's basically what these individual
a person
cells do.
eats a person, but the other person is still in there.
Yeah, they're still in there alive. That's basically what all of our cells done. They ate other cells. And so now what we call a cell are actually a bunch of cells inside of a larger cell.
I see.
And what Jack's saying is that the nucleus, which contains the DNA, he's saying it's disputed as to whether or not
It came from archaea or bacteria. We don't know who's inside who. And it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But you know
But it's
what?
interesting.
You know what is germane to the topic? I'm going to ask you this. Why would nature do this? So I'm going to give you the impetus. This is all part of the leptin melanocortin story that happened in Florence. Just think about it for a minute.
I mean, I'm just going to give a one-word answer. Efficiency.
Star changed. We have a G-class star.
Oh, you mean what stimulated this change?
What's the thermodynamic change? Remember, you're the biologist. I'm asking you to step in my realm as a physicist.
Yeah, so the sun is a G-class star.
Correct. And when it gets to its midlife, what do all G-class stars do? They make 10% more UV light. That was the stimulus to join the two domains of life. Why? Because of the effect that oxygen had on the planet. So we call this event, and Brick, I know you've heard it, it's called the Cambrian explosion. Why do I always laugh at people who are like Richard Dawkins, neo-Darwinists? They always love to get on Catholics and religious people because, you know, the shit that we believe in religion, he fights with. Well, guess what? If you believe Darwin, there's no way to explain the Cambrian explosion because literally overnight, 32 phyla of life show up in the fossil record. And this happened 65 million years ago. So when did mammals come into the story? 210 million years ago. Remember, that's our clay. That's who this story, that's why we're all here. Okay?
When did you say the Cambrian explosion was?
About 565 years ago. 565 million years ago.
And
Photosynthesis and mitochondria were built, we think 30 million years, either before or during that event. We don't know that. The guy that you should have on your podcast is Nick Lane from Oxford. He is probably the world expert in mitochondria in your side. The world expert on my side is probably Doug Wallace at Children's Hospital, Philadelphia. And when mitochondria and chlorophyll is made, that's where, Rick, your part of the story starts coming in. All these thermodynamic changes are beginning to be imprinted. So what is the conveyor belt of evolution? Cells are just like semiconductor fabs. They use photolithography to atomically organize atoms in the right place. There is a reason for that answers Andrew's question. Why I want you to understand this process, nature has had 4.6 billion years in this semiconductor fab. So another part of the story, Andrew, that I've really not talked about, when I jumped down the rabbit hole and I realized that semiconduction was a big part of the story, it's because in my research at Vanderbilt University, I came across a paper from 1941 from Budapest that Albert St. Georgi wrote. And this was right after he won his Nobel Prize for vitamin C, when he talked about the TCA cycle. And he said it's very unusual, but I think that all proteins have been selected for some reason because they look like there could be semiconductors.
Ketone IQ, a drinkable dose of ketones. Discover more physical and mental potential. Discover ketosis without fasting. Ketones improve metabolic health and appetite control. It's used by top performers for gentle, long-lasting energy. Ketone IQ. 1 dose in the morning for cognition, up to 3 doses before a workout. No sugar, no caffeine. Ketone IQ. A metabolic superfuel. Visit hvmn.com and use the code TETRA for 20% off your next purchase. Ketone IQ.
Could you explain for people just a little bit about how a semiconductor works?
Yeah. It's pretty simple. Basically, the original story, how did we find semiconduction? I think that story is actually interesting too. This is at the turn of the century, right before Albert Einstein writes his, big papers in 1905. Indian scientist named Bose, and we're not talking about the Bose, from the speakers. He was probably the biggest and best scientist India has ever put out. He took a hunk of silicon and shined light on it. And he had a fan on the desk, and he realized that he was creating an electric current. And when the fan turned, the current would go on and off and on and off. And he goes, "Oh, this is bizarre." He and his work was stolen by Marconi. Marconi wound up getting the Nobel Prize because he took a lot of people's work, including Tesla and Edison, and he created wireless technology. One of the things that Bose actually found back in England, because this is where the work was done, is that if there was impurities or crack in the silicon, that it would change the DC electric current, because that's what semiconductors make. They can make DC current from light. And it turns out, the next part of the story for you, this is really important. Albert St. Georgi writes this, and a very famous, at least in my world, I'd love to know if Andrew's ever learned about him, because now you'll begin to understand, how did a neurosurgeon pick this shit up? His name is Robert O. Becker. He's an orthopedic surgeon who's 3 times nominated for the Nobel Prize. And there's a reason Andrew doesn't know about him. I'm kind of hoping Rick knows a little bit about him, because I think Rick's old enough to remember the story. But Becker, basically research was on regeneration. He was an orthopedic surgeon. He was interested in limb regeneration. One of the things that he did, he actually worked on salamanders because they're highly regenerative. He was able to take their hearts out, regenerate their heart from scratch. He did the same thing with their brain, with limbs. One of the interesting things that came out of his research, 2 things. One thing has been lost to science that we're going to talk about today, but it wasn't lost on me, is that he was able to anesthetize his animals just using a magnet. He used a high Gauss, 2000 Gauss magnet and put the salamanders to sleep before he amputated or took their heart out. The other interesting thing that he found is that there's a healing blastema. In other words, limb regeneration, all the basics of how it happens in mammals, he laid out in a series of about 6 papers in the 1960s. This is the reason why the guy was famous. And one of the things right before this career ended is he proved that you could, to this day, you can ask any plastic surgeon, if they go back and look in the literature, you can regenerate the tip of humans' fingers. It's the only part where our regenerative potential still is there. We can't do a whole arm like a salamander, but it has to do with the semiconductive circuits in the body. So some of your listeners, some of the people from Stanford University are hearing me talk about semiconductors and like, how do we know that Jack's right even about semiconductors? Well, it turns out the guy that did the work in the 1960s was Robert O. Becker. He proved that bone, human bone, is a P-type semiconductor. Apatite, hydroxyapatite, is an N-type semiconductor. When you put a current through it, you guess what color light you make? Brown, red light. In other words, bone is a diode. What's the name that, Rick, you and I know? LED. It's exactly the same. That's the first time ever in the published literature that we know that it's in there. Well, why did I learn about this?
So bone is a light-emitting diode.
Correct. And here's the interesting part. 2 copper ions sit in there to rectify the current. Guess whose papers did that? Becker's. All this stuff, and I want you to look at me when I talk to you about this. Do you understand how important this really is? I want you to think about it. If you know what's in bone, as a scientist, I know you're a curious guy. You can only imagine what I was like 20 years ago. You know when I learned about this? When I was a neurosurgery resident. Why? Because I was a spine surgeon. And my chairman, David Klein, taught me about one of your guys from UCSF, about his work on the median nerve. You talked about it in a couple of podcasts. Klein said to me, he goes, you need to square what's going on in bone and what he found in the median nerve. He goes, it may be the same thing. Well, it turns out Becker did. The nerve is a big part of this regeneration process in his papers. He found that the DC electric current runs right underneath the myelin of a nerve, and it's imperative to drive the regeneration process. So I started putting this all together, and I'm going, wait a minute. If collagen is the N-type semiconductor and collagen is carbon-based, then I said, I need to start looking this whole semiconductor thing. And what did I find about semiconduction? Because I still am coming back to your Mueller cell answer. I know this is a circuitous walk, but it's a good walk. I said, I looked at the eye and started pulling it apart. And I said, what the hell is a semiconductor in the eye? And then I started to think about the things I learned from Becker and the things I learned from physics, meaning the Silicon Valley guys. And I said, son of a bitch, the answer is it's melanin. And how did I learn about that? I learned about the band gap conduction of light. And this goes to your field, because I know you're a big color guy and optics. Everything based on color is a semiconductive thing. How did I learn about it from the artist side? You'll love this. In MoMA, back in New York, they had the picture that Da Vinci did. You know, Da Vinci didn't paint a lot of paintings, but the one he painted of St. John the Baptist, where he looks very bizarre. And if you see it in the Louvre today, you notice that it's very dark. One of the things that one of those little ladies taught me when I was in 3rd or 5th grade is that the painting wasn't originally that color. He used cadmium yellow to mix it. Then he added cadmium selenium, and it changed the color to red. But over time, over the 500 years, the way all 3 of us see it today, it's as dark as this microphone. So when you go see it at the Louvre, you look at it and you go, why would he have painted this? This is such a beautiful painting of this. And it's such a dark background. And I realized that's not what he did. It's because the atoms in the paint, because remember back in Da Vinci's day, he used to make his own paint. But what I learned about at paint color when I was in 5th grade is that the atoms in the paint were the key.
They oxidated?
Yes. And the interesting thing is when atoms change their oxidation state, that actually changed their magnetic footprint. And when it changes your magnetic footprint, it changes the way you work with light. And I started to put all this together. I'm going, Jesus Christ, this is it. Light changes the charge density of semiconductive proteins in the eye. So we create our own light show. And then I figured out immediately, as soon as I put that together, why Schrodinger wrote what he wrote in his book, that we're a negative entropy organism. It's because the queerest thing about light, the queerest thing, or I should say life, not light, is that we only use atoms 1 to 53 on the periodic table. We don't use any atom heavier than iodine. But within 1 to 53, we don't use all of them. We only use like 26. But there's some that we use all the time. And these are the ones that Andrew knows: potassium, magnesium, calcium. And they're big in places where big things happen in biology. The other side of the story was I looked at, because of Albert St. Georgi, I looked at proteins. You know that humans, we have DNA. DNA only has 20 proteins. DNA only codes for proteins. Then it dawned on me, DNA only codes for semiconductors. And then I said, what's the queerness of these semiconductors? So I went back to basic biology now. I found out there was 500 amino acids actually out there, but life only uses 20. And in those 20, what was the most special ones? Turned out it was methionine and tryptophan. Do you know why? One codon in DNA. Only one codon. It turns out anytime you make a protein in your body, methionine is the start signal. But what is important about tryptophan? Tryptophan is all the key semiconductive proteins in your eye. And then what did I do? I looked at the absorption spectra of all the aromatic amino acids. You know what I found? 200 to 400 nanometer light. What does that mean in English to you? That is light more powerful than the sun emits. So let me ask you something as a biologist. I'm going to ask you something, both of you, as a man. I know your answer. Do you think nature makes any mistakes?
No.
Yes.
Okay, tell me. I know why you were going to say this. I agree with you, but give me your answer. That's what extinction is, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you already told me earlier that, Darwin might be or is wrong about a number of things. So I'm learning how to catch myself.
No, he didn't go far enough.
Yeah.
He didn't go far enough because he couldn't. He didn't know physics.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna qualify my answer, not because I already know you disagree, but I'm gonna qualify my answer by saying that I don't think nature makes mistakes if we don't subjectively rate the outcome. If we say that the only things that are adaptive are correct and things that are non-adaptive, like leading to extinction of a given species, is incorrect, then I'd say nature makes mistakes. But it becomes a little bit of a semantic argument.
All right, yeah. I'm going to tell you why.
It makes a lot of choices,
right?
And I don't think I or anyone else can say whether or not those are mistakes.
Right. But the point that I want to make to you, because I'm glad you answered the way you did, because this illuminates the problem that you and I have. This is why I'm telling you my eureka moment is important. The eye, mammalian eye, it's gone through evolution and back, meaning cognitive de-evolution 20 times. So I don't think it was a mistake. The reason I don't think it was a mistake is because the thermodynamic givens changed. The eureka moment, which is coming, we're coming to it very close, is important for you to understand why me and Rick are right. Nature never makes a mistake. The problem is you and I are taught as reductionists that we have to see it through the lens today and looking back. What did I have to do? This is where Rick's book really resonated with me. I took myself in that 18 months back to the beginner mindset. I realized that the thermodynamic givens were dinosaurs that flew and mammals, and they were little. And this is my people. What was the thing that changed at that time? A rock that was 6 miles big hit the Yucatan Peninsula through a cube that's 50 by 50 miles wide up into the atmosphere and blocked photosynthesis. We don't know for how long, okay?
Does this event have a name?
Yeah, it's called the KT event. Okay. If you don't believe me, the hole is still there. That's what the cenote system is. All the water in Mexico comes not from rivers, comes from the cenotes. That is 65 million year rainwater that's sitting in carbon deposits. That's deuterium depleted, just like the water your mitochondria makes. And turns out that's where mammals started their comeback. Okay. So why is the KT event important? Because the thermodynamic givens of life at that time, if photosynthesis is blocked, all of us are pretty smart guys. You know that the terminal electron acceptor for mitochondria in the two animals that made it through, which was theropod dinosaurs and mammals, is oxygen. What makes oxygen? Rick, the tree outside, right? So if that was interrupted, how could you make it through? I gave you the answer about birds. They were able to pick up where the fires weren't, where there was still food, fly to it. But those little creatures in the ground that are our ancestors, how in the hell did they do it?
Make their own light.
Yeah, but guess how they did it?
Wow.
Early mammals had all their melanin in their skin. They stayed underground and hibernated, so they were basically nocturnal to stay away from the dinosaurs. This was an advantage, and they were small. They didn't need a lot of food to go. But what was the stimulus? The story goes back to Gurwitch. What did he find? Every time a cell undergoes mitosis in the cell cycle, you have to have UV light. Mammals lived in a planet in the beginning at the KT event where there was no UV light. So what did they do? They took their melanin because, Mr. Huberman, listen to me here. Where does melanin come from? Neuroectoderm, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just as a real brief aside, if I may, I was an early graduate student. So year 1998, I go to a meeting in Washington, D.C., and a guy named Iggy Provencio stands up and says that he thinks he's discovered broadly speaking, the pigment in the eye that allows us to set our circadian rhythms, broadly speaking. And everyone's excited because no one's been able to find this pigment. We know it's not in standard photoreceptors. You can rip out the back of the eye, and we and other animals will still do this. In fact, people who are pattern blind can still do this. And then he tells us about melanopsin. Sounds cool. It's opsin in it. Sounds like any other opsin, like rhodopsin or et cetera. And then he tells us that it is essentially homologous to frog melanocytes. So he shows a picture of basically we have the same stuff of frog skin in our
Just so we're
eye.
clear for everybody listening, frogs are amphibians, not mammals, not our tribe.
Right. And then now we know that the molecular, so he's right. Turns out he's right. And doesn't get enough credit for that discovery. But
He does for me because I've read his papers.
Right. He's and he's a real good guy, and maybe too good a guy. He should have fought harder for recognition. But what we're talking about him now, so that's great. And then what's really interesting is as people then sequence that opsin, use modern sequencing to sequence that opsin, what they find is that it's what's called a rhabdomeric opsin, which is essentially the same opsins that insects use. So we have insect biology and what is the equivalent of frog melanophores in our eyes.
You know what else is important about insects? They see UV light. That's how they know to bite you, because you emit it. So do you understand this trend? So I want you to remember Gurwitch. This is the key part for you.
The onion.
The onion is the story because you never read it. But the other part that I know you didn't learn is that the mitogenic radiation that we use to get the cell cycle through to divide is mitosis. Here's where your disbelief is going to come.
I just want to know the part where we start rubbing up next to quartz in order to generate light within our cells.
Well, but every medical student, this is a sidebar to the story, but I like the sidebars because I think it fills in the gaps. That's something I learned from Rick's book, that we need to talk about either sidebars and throw it all together.
So you never know.
You never know what somebody else is going to get. But I want to give you guys in total how this happened to me, because the story is unbelievable. I can't believe it. Getting emotional about it. So the little creatures take the melanin and they internalize it. Now,
Did they hibernate?
I'm going to tell you why. This is really they had the ability to hibernate. That's not the critical part of the story.
Okay.
I want you to understand the
I'm trying
UV
to
light
picture it. That's why I asked.
and the mammal, and I'm focusing on him now because he needs to get this.
Okay.
If you suspend your belief for a minute, because you're going to have to, that Gurwitz and Pop and Roland Van Wyck, that's a new name for you, in his book called Light Sculpting Life, are correct. And ultra weak UV light is what stimulates mitosis in all cells. Okay? That means mammals are neuroplastic in their neuroectoderm. And what does that mean? That means cell migration in the body in mammals is possible. So mammals were able, when they lived in a world 65 million years ago that had no UV light, they were able to take their melanocytes and put them inside themselves.
So just to explain to Rick and people, so mitosis is a part of a process where cells can divide, and then cells can migrate within the body, but typically not long distances. Like that, like people generally don't believe that, I should say.
Okay, so stop for a minute. Is that true about immune cells? Tell me about the process of diapedesis.
Yeah. So certain cell types can migrate long distances in the body. In general, we don't think about neurons migrating long distances.
Stop for a minute. So I talked to you about nuclei and I talked to you about white blood cells. Do you know that in rats and humans, what we found? Do you know that POMC is present in white blood cells?
Did not know that.
Yeah. So guess what? You just gave the conventional wisdom advice. There's a reason that white blood cells can go really far. It's the same reason that the melanocytes can. Diapedesis is the remnant of neuroectodermal ability still in mammals today. We use that with us 2 to 4 million years ago. The transition from chimp to ape, really, I should say chimp to human, you're going to hear as part of this story is actually a story about melanin. We have 3 types of melanin in us. Why don't you tell the audience what those 3 types are?
We've got a alpha melanin. No?
Eumelanin, pheomelanin, and neuromelanin. Do you know what the difference between those 3 are? How the semiconductor is doped. One uses nitrogen, the other one uses sulfur, and the other one uses phosphorus. Remember I told you about the periodic table? Here's the other interesting thing. We have 3 guys right here. I don't have anybody else we can. We got somebody we can use. Rick has more of one type of melanin. You and I have another. And my nurse and her hair, your hair too, has neuromelanin. And it turns out, now we're back to the semiconductor story. Anything that's dark, okay, what does that mean? It absorbs all frequencies of light, not visible light, from RF to cosmic radiation. Why would that have been important, Dr. Huberman, on the planet 4.6 billion years ago? Because guess what? Cosmic radiation got into Earth. Melanin, that story goes way far back. Why is this really important for Rick? Inside the human cochlea, which is shaped as a spiral, is what? Melanin. Everybody thinks in neurology that we hear the way they think we hear. I'm going to tell you that you hear light. And we transmit the light into sound. And it turns out this is the reason why gentamicin causes hearing loss.
Tell me what this is. Gentamicin is an antibiotic
that we don't use anymore. But do you know why? What's an endolymph? You know the endolymphatic duct. This is not for you now. This is for him.
Endolymph is this like viscous stuff that
it's in your cochlea.
That's in the cochlea, and von Beckesy and these guys discovered the way that you have these hair cells that deflect and cause electrical potentials that we think of as hearing. You think von Beckesy was wrong? We'll take away von Beckesy's Nobel.
Yeah. So what did you learn in biology just that I did?
The endolymph
what is the crazy thing about endolymph that's still to this day in?
I have to interrupt for a moment. I have to say something that I realize the reason that Jack is so angry with Andrew is because he's angry at himself before he understood it.
Correct.
That's what it is.
It's true. Totally true.
It's the frustration of, why didn't I know this?
Yes.
Why wasn't I taught this?
I know I'm a smart guy, and I have to tell you, I can't believe how freaking stupid I was to buy the line of bullshit for 40 years. That's the
what's
truth.
happening here.
So when you said we're going to time travel, this is what he meant.
Yes.
No, that's what's happening.
But that's what I look at as you've got a really popular podcast out there. And I don't give a shit about your audience. I'm going to be honest with you. That's probably not what you want to hear. But you know what I do care about? I know that you're the dude that the kids at Stanford are going to listen to. And I want to tell you something so that maybe I can suspend your disbelief, that you can go fact check Uncle Jack and find out, am I really crazy? Or maybe is there something to this?
No, I don't think you're crazy. And I'll tell you why I don't think you're crazy. Because a year and a half ago, I listened to a book called The Prince of Medicine about Galen. And which is essentially it's really dense, but it's basically a story of the history of medicine and the fact that, you know, he went to Egypt where he could dissect bodies because he couldn't do that back home. And he was working on gladiators. And basically what you discover is that medicine and biology have been constrained by human and social factors. And I'll just say it, political factors that basically have limited discovery at every step. The other thing that I know from my own experience is that, and you know, and I was fortunate enough to say this at Stanford a few nights ago because they had this big donor event and it was a very, let's say, politically diverse group of people in the audience. Think about every major political group in the same room. By the way, these people do gather in the same room around certain topics like their health. And I said to them what I'll say now, which is that one of the best things and worst things about science is this notion of lineage. So like the guys I worked for the guys that got the Nobel Prize for neuroplasticity, David Hubel and Torrance of Weasel. They didn't discover neuroplasticity, but they made important contributions. One of the problems with people needing to do their PhD and postdoc is they publish papers and then you need someone to review those papers and grants. And so what ends up happening is you get these silos that build more silo type arrangement. In other words, it's hard to really do anything new because there's literally no one who understands what you're talking about.
Can I interrupt you for a minute?
So all I'll say is that I'm of the mind that science needs to change. And
I agree with you.
Add to that, it's everything. It's not science.
Right. It's everything.
It's not medicine.
I agree.
It's everything. It's the arrogance of humans who think they know something and that something is everything. And they're wrong.
Right. And the only way to truly, quote unquote, make it in a field is to stay within that channel, plus or minus 10 to 15 degrees of latitude. And, you know, one of my great hopes for the podcast was always that I'd eventually have a conversation like this that would eventually allow me to run something, like you said, run something back to my colleagues. Because I think at their core, real scientists and physicians want the truth.
We're curious,
but they're also career driven. They're career, which does not mean they make stuff up, but they are willing to put the blinders on because it's really inconvenient.
But they are in a system that tells them what's true, and if the system tells them what's true and it's not true, how could they ever have a chance?
Well, you and I sat down with a good friend of mine who's a neurosurgeon. He's chair of neurosurgery at UCSF now, Eddie Chang. And
I got news for you. We're going to talk about Eddie Chang because you know what? I'm going to hit you with this. You guys, all three of you talked about when he took the tumor out of Broca's area and he couldn't believe how much he took. This story that I'm unfolding for you right now actually answers that question.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I've known him since I was 9 years old, and you guys
grew up together,
and
right?
We grew up together. And Rick and I sat on Rick's porch about 8 months ago, and Rick asked Eddie, he said, what percentage of information that's present in medical textbooks that do you think is wrong?
He said 50.
And he said approximately 50.
Totally disagree.
And then Rick said, what do you think the implications of that are? And Eddie said, incalculable. Now, and listen, Eddie, I've known him since we were 9 years old. More than anyone I know wants to do right in the world. So he's not saying that to be controversial. He's not saying that to avoid controversy. I think that every good physician, like Eddie, like you, understands that the system that they were educated in is largely ignorant to many, many things.
But I think the number one issue, at least in centralized medicine, actually comes down to profit. I'm talking about modern medicine last 50 years. Before that, I would agree with you, science has a problem. But when I wanted to interrupt you earlier, it's not because I was trying to be an ass. I want to pose this question to you because you and I are both biology people. Don't you find it a little bit interesting that in 1905, a patent clerk from Bern could publish 4 papers that completely blew up physics? I mean, I want you to think about it. You know that you and I cut our teeth on randomized controlled clinical trials. Einstein did thought experiments in his head and wrote 4 papers.
It's amazing those papers were ever even looked at.
Correct. But you know, the funny thing is, out of all those papers, do you know, out of all of them, which is the most cited paper?
I don't.
Brownian motion. It goes towards a lot of the things that hopefully you'll learn in biology, but the one that the other sacred cow I want to slay is, you have heard the term many, many times, because I know I have, Occam's razor.
Mm-hmm. Parsimony.
Right. And tell me, and I'm asking you this question, because in my journey to figure out this leptin prescription and the leptin and melanocortin pathway, this was one of the biggest things I had to overcome. Tell me, what is Occam's razor about the photoelectric effect?
I couldn't tell you. All I know is Occam's razor is parsimony, meaning that Occam's razor posits, I don't want to say I do because I'm learning to catch myself. Occam's razor posits that the simplest explanation is the best one.
But, and here's the thing, the greatest physicists of the time, Helmholtz, Planck, Bohr, all of them, a patent clerk. Think about what's in Rick's book, the essence of it. He took paradox, the same thing that Da Vinci and Michelangelo did, and he turned it around and looked at it. So what happened to me? I looked at the paradox in the photoelectric effect. I looked at what Einstein really found. And he said, well, obviously it's only electrons are excited by light. So that's part of the story. And it's not every part of light that the photoelectric effect works on.
UV?
You got it. And guess what? UV drives all nonlinear optical programs. I found that out in my journey. So I'm going, guess what? The brain is a hydrated carbon-based quantum computer that runs via wide base semiconduction. Why is the wide base thing? I keep coming back to it. I left you off before we got on this tangent, this happy sidetrack. Endolymphatic duct. Tell me what you learned about in biology that makes it special. It's the one tissue in the body that has an unbelievable ionic character. It's loaded with potassium. Do you know what potassium makes when it's with chloride? A wide-based semiconductor.
Yeah, when we record from neurons, when we want to record electrical potentials from neurons, we basically fill a little tube of glass, poke it into a cell. These are really small tubes, as Jack knows, and fill it with potassium chloride, because the potassium chloride is kind of contiguous with the inside of the cell. So you're essentially becoming part of the cell, trying to become part of the cell so you can listen to the inner workings of the cell.
Correct. But the interesting thing is, and I apologize to you.
It's all good.
Something that I hope you take back to Eddie Chang that you guys sit down and talk about. You never got into this with Eddie. He's the only podcast that I've actually listened of yours full through. Why? Because he's a neurosurgeon. I'm interested. The thing that made neurosurgery great from its beginnings to now was a guy named Yasser Gil. He basically brought the operating microscope. Like when you guys first came in, I told you, this is my comfortable position because I sit in a microscope to operate. So I feel like I'm doing this right now.
For those listening, Jack is straddling the microphone's up near his mouth, but he's sitting, yes, exactly as a surgeon would. So
right.
He's dissecting our brains.
Right. And what I'm basically telling you, again, I'm folding the story for you. It's the leptin melanocortin pathway is brain surgery without a scalpel. Mm-hmm. That is how I've described it in podcasts that I've done it before. And I'm trying to tell you, that's literal and figurative. I mean it. So anyway, the calcium chloride is in your endolymph. What does that do? It creates light that goes from the very extreme low frequency UV light all the way up. So guess what I realized right away? That's the reason why life picked the 4 aromatic amino acids because the absorption spectrum marries to calcium, magnesium, sodium, and all the semiconductors that are in there, nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, and phosphorus.
Okay, I need to take a step back here or a pause just because I want to make sure I know how important this is because I've heard you say it on multiple podcasts and I want to make sure I internalize it. And I haven't done that yet, not because I don't believe it, but because I just haven't internalized it. You talked about DNA as a magnetic strip. I'm sure we'll come back to that. You're talking about the base pairs that make up DNA, the code for life.
Yep, AGCT.
Yep, are activated, basically do their business within the visible spectrum of light, meaning the visible spectrum of light to us.
No, I would tell you that it goes deeper than that. It goes right to the story.
To the UV.
It goes to 200 all the way to, I think, 760.
And we can't see down to 200.
No,
we basically pick up around what, like
390?
390.
That's why I said, this is also in Rick's book. Rick says you don't have to see all the reality. But again, Rick's not a scientist, but what the retina sees is not what the sun provides. And it turns out, guess what? What a cell sees is not what the sun provides. That's the story.
Right.
That's the Yassergill story. What am I trying to tell you? Eddie and I both know that neurosurgery changed when the operating microscope went in. What was the difference? We could see at smaller levels to do better surgery. What am I describing to you happened to me at David's statue? I went even smaller. Mm-hmm. I went down to the atomic organization inside of a cell, not the protein level, not the macronutrient level, not even the mitochondrial level. We're talking about all the way down to the periodic table of elements and then what happens with water. So you
went ultra reductionist.
Yes, totally. But I had to also realize that the things that I was learning in physics at the time, okay, because what I did effectively is very similar. I stole this from Einstein. I always tell people the 4 most important scientists to me were Einstein, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Robert O. Becker. Those were the 4 people that have defined my life. And Feynman too. I got to put number 5 in. Feynman was big when he won the Nobel Prize in 1965. Why? Because most of what I believe is tied to Feynman's work in QED, which is quantum electrodynamics. The point that I was trying to make to you is I took all these things that happened to me from my knee and me being fat, and I disbelieved what I thought was true, that I could use neuroplasticity to actually lose weight if I embraced sunlight and cold. And what did I learn about cold? Because this is for you, Rick. What does cold fundamentally do? It increases the amount of UV light that wide-band semiconductors emit. In other words, we make more powerful light than the sun creates inside. What does that mean? 1944, Erwin Schrödinger, what do you say? Negative entropy. How do you slow time down? You would have to have light more powerful than the sun to do it. Then, what did I realize? How do we capture light? I gave you the answer for Rick in the ear. What is melanin next to in the ear? What is it next to in the eye? Water. What do they use in nuclear reactors? Water. I said, oh shit, water has a huge heat capacity. I learned that when I was in 3rd grade. So then I started to look at water and I found Martin Chaplin. I found Gilles Doucet. All these guys are biophysicists. They're all physicists by training. I learned that water changes when light hits it. I didn't know that. I thought water is H2O. Then I found out that water can be deuterium-2O. And then I found,
easy water.
Right. And then I started to find out that humans keep all their deuterium in their blood, and mitochondria, which innovated photosynthesis for people. I don't know how you're going to do this with the sound engineer, but this is what I tell people. This is photosynthesis, and this is a mitochondria. It's a spider jumping on a mirror. Yeah. You take in photosynthesis sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water and create sugar. Mitochondria takes sugar and turns it back into carbon dioxide and water. What's the difference? Photosynthesis uses the hydrology cycle on the planet, both H plus and deuterium. But guess what biology does? All those things that you learned in biochemistry about the 8 enzymatic steps in glucose metabolism. Did you ever wonder why in the hell Are we built this way? It's a very simple answer. It's because we have to eliminate the deuterium. Because it turns out when you eliminate the deuterium at the mitochondrial matrix, where you make water at cytochrome C oxidase, becomes deuterium depleted, changes the dielectric constant.
I just recorded an episode on water. You're going to hate it. But here's
who did you record it with?
It was a solo episode, but here's what's great about having a podcast. We can get you on to square the story.
Yeah.
Well, but I wouldn't say square the story because you know what I think?
I mean, I don't think I said anything that counteracts what you said. I did talk about
you didn't cover this.
No, I didn't cover this is what I mean. And I'm regretting that I didn't, but I did cover structured water and fourth phase of water and some of that. So I touched on some of that.
But I'm going to tell you, I want you to change that. Rick doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to tell you, since the last time Rick and I were physically together was 2015 with the vegan. We won't mention the vegan's name. But Rick at that time wanted me to do the same thing I'm doing with you now. He says, look, I want you to try to help this guy because he's clear he's off the beaten path. And I try to tell Rick, some people you just can't help. You learn that in neurosurgery because your mind has to be open. And I guess the point that I'm trying to tell you about this whole process with me is that when I realized that the answer was at the atomic level, I had to think back to what was going on in Earth. Like there's a number in that book that I wrote, and I said, I'll tell you what it is. It's the story of the Chinese board that you had in there. When you come to
the game of Go,
right? The game of Go. When you come to move 37, the KT event was move 37 for life. So what effectively did they do? Because I want you to understand this. When you pull melanin inside, and I told you, the reason why this is important, you have to remember that Gurwitch found that UV light is what stimulates mitosis. Well, if mitosis is stopped, then it tells you this is how neuroplasticity works. Then you begin to say, this makes sense for autism. This makes sense for metastasis. What am I saying, Andrew? I'm saying that mammals invented metastasis to survive. We look at metastasis as a negative connotation pathway because we look at it from cancer because that's what we see in the modern world.
Just so that people know, so during development, we all undergo tons and trillions of hundreds of trillions of mitotic cycles. Cells divide, right? It was sperm, egg, and basically we are here because cells can divide. But at some point after development, no one knows where to draw that line. Conventional biology and medicine have decided that cell replication, unless it's, to heal a wound or something, is metastasis, right? I mean, this idea that you don't want your glial cells metastasizing means you don't want them duplicating. So, but one thing before you go any further, and this won't be a long tangent, I promise, is what I'm starting to realize with you is that you're not necessarily saying that anything that I was taught is wrong. What you're saying is we're just not looking in the right places. Those aren't the answers or the complete answers.
But do you know where it starts though? This is one of my goals to come meet you. I'm going to tell you where we go off the rails because you are a researcher and you know this. I told you Doug Wallace is one of the people that I really respect. He's the guy that figured out maternal inheritance of mitochondria. This obviously is the story I'm laying out for you is a big mitochondrial story.
All your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mom.
Right. So what Wallace effectively has said, this is why I laughed when I heard you guys talk with Eddie Chang. If you would ask me the same question you asked Eddie Chang, I would have said less than 1%. And I would have said, it's the reason why modern medicine, people keep getting sicker because we do everything the wrong way.
I want to say the question I asked Eddie Chang was, in today's medical books, how much of what's being taught in today, at the moment, how much of it is right and how much of it is wrong?
0.1%.
Eddie Chang said 50%, which seemed insane.
And then you asked him what the implications of that were for human health, and he said incalculable.
Incalculable. And Jack is saying Eddie's being too kind by 49.9%.
No, the magnitude is millionfolds.
Yeah.
And let me explain to you the implications because I want to get back to what I just said to you. Because what I just said to you for Andrew to accept, because this is what moved me.
Yeah.
When I realized that metastasis is how mammals and theropod dinosaurs got through, they survived. they were able to increase the bandwidth. They created their own light inside when the sun couldn't create it. And melanin was the key to the story. Why? Because melanin is the darkest pigment on this planet. It absorbs all frequencies of light. So if you could create your own light inside, you could get through that event. So you can imagine, Andrew, the first thing that I thought of when all this was in my head, I still haven't had my eureka moment. I said, you know what I need to do to see if I'm right? I need to go home and find a black person who's got vitiligo. And you happen to know one of those guys, Michael Jackson, who's now dead. I found that person. You know what my crazy question was before I did this biohack on myself? I said, how long, if the KT asteroid was 6 miles wide, how long was photosynthesis disrupted to cause this process? I thought, from the books I had read, they said anywhere from 100 to 1,000 years. I'm going, that's kind of impossible to have the food chain disrupted that long for animals to survive. Because remember, all the food web on this planet is tied to photosynthesis, contrary to what the food gurus tell you. The interesting part of the story is, to answer the question, I took this lady, I put her picture in your blog that I wrote for you. I was able to do it in 3 months. I used UV light, put it on her white areas, and all her melanin pigment came in.
So you cured her vitiligo.
Well, it's gone. But guess what? You go to the dermatology clinic at UCSF or Stanford, and they'll tell you that is batshit crazy.
Yeah, there's no cure. They'll tell you there's no
exactly.
cure.
They're going to give you something from, Allegra. Yeah. Oh, use this. Now, it also brings the other situation. You're probably now thinking, does this explain melasma now in people? That's another disease that dermatologists have nothing to do. Why? Because you know what you're doing? You're effectively stealing your melanocytes from inside your head and putting them on your face. And what stimulates that? Blue light. You know what's pro-growth for melanocytes? Blue light, subtracted from the red. This is one of the problems you and I do have. Blue light by itself is the light that we create. Modern lighting is exactly the same as the KT event. Here's the difference now. Mammals have most of their melanin inside their brains. So when you lose it, think about all the people that you've talked about on your podcast about dopamine problems. Before you came, I told Rick that his book is basically the study of human frontal lobe development from schizophrenia, which is dopamine to the max, but the voltage-gated channels are kicking it out like crazy. The best way I could describe it to you, it's because I want you to get this. I thought about this when I had a dream about coming here to talk to you guys. It's comparing acid metal to Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd being depression, which is low dopamine and big, huge spikes. Everything I read in your book, you have been associated with people that have the gamut of dopamine. I want you to know that dopamine is created by phenylalanine or tyrosine, the two aromatic amino acids, 200 to 400 nanometer light. The people that you have sampled through their skin, their face, your interactions with them, you've sampled every single one of them. You're entangled to them. Their music is in your hydrogen bonding network of the water that's produced in your cell. When we did your biohack, the first thing I thought of, I have to turn him on to methylene blue and explain it to him because I have to protect. If his brain goes south in that surgery, I need to protect the hydrogen bonding network because you are the master tape.
Can I tell this story to Andrew? Because
does he know it?
No.
No. So Andrew, just so you know, I was sworn to secrecy not to talk about this.
Okay.
And this actually happened at your institution. So I just want to let you know, if you tell me not to say something, I'm pretty good, right? I won't say it.
Yeah,
great.
no,
I was personal about the whole thing, but I want to tell you the story.
Yeah, I want to hear this story.
So I was going in for open heart surgery, which is a big thing. And I was going to be put out for, 6 hours. And I remember...
On pump. Remember, the pump is the big part of this story.
And I remember my surgeon was excited to tell me, and I might even get to freeze your brain, which I think he did do. And
now you probably have an idea why it works.
So I spoke to, now it does make more sense. So and this all happened because ITEA asked me to get a test. I called ITEA. He's like, I think you got to do this test. Because I did the test, and the person who did the test called. I was with ITEA when the test was done, and then the guy called. He's like, "You guys got to come back here to the lab." Go back to the lab. Look at they're having a medical conversation. I have no idea what they're talking about. Are they talking about the numbers? And they're like, okay, you need open heart surgery as soon as possible. Not emergency, but as, like within the next 2 months. And I said, why? I'm fine. I feel fine. And they said, the chances are you have a 50% chance that over the next year, you'll fall down. And if this happens, you'll fall down. You'll have to go to the hospital. And if you get to the hospital in, I can't remember what it was, maybe 45 minutes. If you're at the hospital within 45 minutes, you'll have a 50-50 chance of surviving. And you have a 50% chance that that'll happen this year. And you'll have that forevermore. So I'm thinking, well, sometimes I fly to Europe. What happens if it happens on the plane? What happens if it's like I don't always have 45 minutes? And I live in some pretty remote places. So I was convinced to do this surgery, which is very much against my character. As you know, my appendix burst, and I still have my appendix, which was a questionable thing at the time. So I'm going into the surgery. I'm scared. This is not my area of comfort, doing surgery. I'm needle phobic. I
didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm needle phobic in addition to everything else. And I call some friends of mine who I feel like know things that maybe the surgeon at Stanford, who's the best in the world, still might not know. And I called Jack Kruse. And Jack Kruse said, this is what I want you to do. And he was very clear about it. He said, I want you to ask your surgeon if he'll do this. And if your surgeon says no, don't fight with your surgeon. Because you don't want to go under the knife with someone who you're having a disagreement with.
Smart.
Yeah. So if you won't do it, it's okay, but it would really be good for you if you can get him to do it. So I call ITEA after what he wanted me to do was have an IV of methylene blue going during the surgery. Uh-huh. And Jack said, because the heart surgeon is going to be focused on your heart and keeping you alive, and I'm focused on your brain.
I'm going to be in surgery with you through the methylene blue.
Yeah. That's
so
what he said.
Quantum Engineering 29 is that story. That's Rick's story.
Yeah, I definitely want to make sure that we talk about methylene blue. I need to learn about
So let me tell you what happens. The rest of the story. I call ITEA and I say, a friend of mine recommends that I get methylene blue IV during the surgery. And he's like, don't even ask. If you ask the surgeon this, he'll think you're crazy and not want to operate on you. We're lucky that we got you this surgeon. He's the best in the world. Don't ask. Can't help myself. I ask. And the surgeon said, absolutely not. And his point was an interesting one. He said, the reason you came to me is because the odds that I get when I do the surgery are 5 times better than everyone else in the world who does it. If I were to go to a hospital, I would have a 5% chance of dying randomly for this surgery. And with him, I have a 1% chance just based on his lifetime records, like 5 times better odds. He said, the reason my odds are that good is because I do it exactly the same way every time.
He's a semiconductor factory. That's what he is. That's what surgeons are. But guess what? The best part of the story for me was
did you get to put in the methylene blue?
No. And then, but I've been taking it orally ever since Jack suggested it, still to this day. And then I did, after the surgery, I did Peter ITEA's podcast. And the only place I've ever talked about surgery publicly was Peter ITEA, because it's personal. There's no reason for me to talk about it. Has nothing to do with what I do in the world. But
it does, though.
I talked to Peter for 2 hours, more than 2 hours, and we talked about surgery at the end. And then he said, and this is 6 months after the surgery, and he said, you remember you called me with that crazy idea about methylene blue? Well, I've been doing research lately, and it turns out Jack Kruse was right. It would have been great for you to be on methylene blue.
Oh, my goodness.
So it's like, even from the naysayers, they come around when they have the data. And it was a big, and I remember I think I sent you a message like,
well, what you had there was a committee of physicians who, represent a lot of different domains of and looking through different lenses into the same problem. I just will confess, I know like basically nothing about methylene blue, except I think I used to use it to clean my fish tanks when I was a kid.
Well, you will.
Yeah.
There's a reason that you use it for that, and it works great for that. But guess what? It goes back to our story. So when I told you that this leptin-melanocortin pathway was basically fed by an anterior semiconductive circuit from visible light so that you could create very low frequency UV light between 200 and 400 nanometers, the idea that happened at Michelangelo's statue, I was like, wait a minute. If I'm right, I'm going to write all this stuff down. I'm going to go home and I should be able to lose weight. I didn't believe anything about what I had found, but I could not argue with what I found. And faced with conventional wisdom, I already went to my primary care doctor and he told me to eat less and exercise more, and it didn't work. I put 30 pounds on. I said, why don't I give crazy a shot?
Nothing to lose.
All right. So I went and did it. And guess what? 11 months, I lost 133 pounds.
You gonna tell us what you did?
Yeah, it's called the leptin prescription. It's on my jackcruz.com site. 6 steps. If you read it, you'll never see anything that we're talking about today. That blog is just like Rick's book. It's written with words without science. Why? Because I knew if I told you the truth, you'd get the same story that you got from Peter Attia or your surgeon at Stanford. So what am I laying out to you today? All the details of what's in the leptin prescription.
So the leptin prescription tells you what to do, but it doesn't tell you why. It doesn't explain it. It's just, this is what I did, and these were my results.
And Andrew, just so you know, to this very day, I still haven't told Rick why methylene blue.
Can I I just want to put something in here, and I want to be clear as to why I'm saying it. At no point today am I here to like contradict or support anything you say, just to like make friends or make enemies. Like, cause I was thinking about this driving over, and I was trying to embrace the spirit of why we're here. And I realized like it would be foolish of me to do that, because it might win me something in the short term with you. Like you might feel like, oh, we have resonance. But in the end, I know you, even though we don't know each other very well at all, I know you to be somebody who like doesn't want that. Like, so if I say something that validates, I just want you to know it's because it pops to mind as like, oh, this fits. And if I think something that doesn't, I'll say that too. I'm not saying that.
And to want to understand why. Like this doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
That's the right question.
So I won't make this a long story, but after the Iggy Provencio thing, years later, I got interested in the circadian photoregulation system and seasonal rhythmicity too, which is to me even more interesting, right? At some level. And I became really good friends with a guy named Samar Hattar, who just by way of credentials, he's the head of the chronobiology unit at the National Institutes of Mental Health, and made a lot of the important discoveries about intrinsically photosensitive cells in the eye, melanopsin, et cetera, picking up on the early discoveries of Iggy. He's a Lebanese guy, very, very interesting, very committed to biology. And he made some of the first animals where, transgenic animals, where the cells that make these opsins are labeled so that you can see them. And of course, they're in the eye, and they're in the very cells that Iggy hypothesized they would be there, et cetera. It all works out. And it works out in human too when you look at the eyes of humans. But here's what's crazy and amazing and cool in light of today's discussion. The brains of those animals also contain cells that express melanopsin. And so, in other words, these, there's a dogma that I now think is false, but the dogma is there's quote unquote no extraocular photoreception, that unless something is on the surface of the body, it cannot respond directly to light, right? And in birds, yes, in other amphibia, yes, but in humans, no extraocular photoreception. That's the idea. That's the dogma.
When you say on the surface of the skin, do you mean only through the eyes?
Through the eyes.
Or the skin.
Or the skin.
Because remember, on the cornea now, we know that neuropsin there, which is an illumination detector for UVA light, but he's now popping another discussion that I didn't think we were going to have, But we're going to have it now because we're going to talk about the microbiome.
So Sammer shows
the microbiome is doing the same thing. And guess what its target is? Sorry about that.
Microbiota.
No. Enterochromaffin cells. Where's all the serotonin in your body, my friend?
In the gut.
There you go. So guess what? You're going to start understanding.
No, the pieces are falling together. So just to wrap it to make sure. And so he shows the brains of these animals, and lo and behold, there are melanopsin expressing cells in the brain, which makes no sense if light can't get in through the skull.
Correct.
But it does make sense if cells are able to generate their own light. Now, I have asked Sammer about this. I was like, what the hell is going on with melanopsin in the brain? That, like, why would you have photoreceptors deep in the brain if light can't get deep into the brain? And the answer was, not by him, because I want to leave it open for revision by him. The answer was, it's just leaky transgene expression, which is basically biology speak for like the method is not very good. It's for I don't know.
No, or it doesn't mean I don't know. It means the body's making a mistake.
Right. But papers have come out in the last few years showing that if you put purple light, I think it was, into the into the hypothalamus of mice, you get direct effects that are independent of the environment of the animal. Okay, so I just want to like seed that in because
why don't we seed this in? I mean, I am agent provocateur. I came here with the agreement from Rick that he would talk about his surgery with you here because I want to just throw the stuff down. So your friend Eddie Chang, don't you find it amazing when he does epilepsy surgery or he does, say, a pallidotomy for Parkinson's? What is effectively he doing? He's putting a DC pulse generator back into their brain. What is this, son? Tell me. It's a cathode ray that creates DC electric current. Who proved that in the 1960s? Robert O. Becker at Syracuse. It's not Jack Kruse's opinion. So what did Jack Kruse do at the foot of David? He took all aspects of things that he knew, very similar to what happened in the 1905 paper about the photoelectric effect. I'm trying to make sense thermodynamically of what's really going on in our body. And when I figured it out that we were creating more light inside us, that's when the story got more interesting because you talked about melanopsin. We found out about melanopsin in 2009. We found out in 2017 that it's in every blood vessel. Now we know it's the single number one opsin in the human brain in 2023. So you asked the right question. The reason I'm happy is that you're going, does nature make any mistakes? Didn't I ask you that earlier? Do you see where I'm going with this? So the other thing is I know that you know that we've got melanin in places that just don't make any sense. And we are the most complex mammal on the planet. For you to understand what happened to me at David.
It's not a mistake.
It's not a mistake. You got to go back to those simple rodents that were underground. How the hell did they live? Well, the number one thing I now know, this is the only speculation I'm giving you in this podcast, because everything I've said to this point, I know to be axiomatically true. It doesn't need to go through a randomized controlled trial. Do you want to know why? Because the laws that my opinion is based on are physical laws. They're not subject to a randomized controlled
It's not theoretical.
Correct. The photoelectric effect is present on Earth just as it is in Andromeda. We know that. So the point that I'm trying to make to you is that once you see this, you see biology through this lens. Rick sees it through his lens in his book. I know how you see it because I used to be you. What I'm asking you is to do what Gassi Yassergil did to Eddie Chang and to me. Let's go deeper. I look at the situation I'm in now. I feel like I have the answers, and centralized medicine is being in a burning building.
Yeah.
You know, patients are basically meat, and the system is making sausage.
That's what it feels like to me. That's what it feels like to me as a bystander. I'm not part of the system.
Well, you are.
What? No, because
you got filleted.
Yeah, but against my will. Against my will. If it wasn't for IT's insistence, there's no chance I would have done it. And I even told, Tell
me the collateral effects of the methylene blue papers when he read them. Because, he's a surgeon, but he's not really a surgeon anymore.
Now he's on it. Like, I don't know if he's taking it, but then the next thing was, well, how do we get good quality? Like, how do we know if it's food grade? How do we know? Like,
well, it's a pharmaceutical. It's USP rated. You have to have a prescription to get it, but that's the best stuff.
You need a prescription to get methylene blue.
The good stuff, the stuff I use in surgery.
What are your thoughts on people taking MSH as
Alpha.
a peptide?
Yeah, no.
People take it for weight loss and to tan.
Yeah.
You can. There's a
Melatonin,
peptide
called
melanotan, right?
Yeah.
People take it. It makes them lose fat, get tan, and hair trigger erections.
So what I would tell
because
you,
it's like being out in the sun, basically. It's
but
interesting.
Does it work or does it not work?
Oh, it works. But here's the problem. So this is when Jack gets a little controversial. I don't know how he's going to feel about it, but this goes directly to the people that support his podcast. I have a very simple rule for my Black Swan mitochondriacs. I tell them, if your body makes it, you're not designed to take it. Why? Because of what I've shared with you already, because it's about the atomic molecular organization in a cell. So, for example, I know that you're big into supplements. You actually mentioned recently that you take a shit ton of them. And I said to Chantel, I said, hopefully that's something I can get him to change because it's a waste of time and a waste of money. But I want you to understand why. So, and it's not that I don't use them in certain places. I will tell you when I use them and why I do it. But I want you to get the gist of why I say what I say so you understand exactly what I mean. Mm-hmm. If you take melatonin, and I'm just going to use this as an example because kids now are using it.
Well, I'm not a fan of, I've gone public saying I'm not a fan of
I know you're not, but I'm using this because
I take 2 milligrams every night.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, you're going to change that probably when you hear what I'm going to say. So if you put my name in a Google box with Biohack 722, I did this literally 17 years ago when I was trying to figure all this shit out. That's the perfect way to destroy the photoreceptors in your eye. You thin the retina. You actually start to cause actual AMD. So you don't want to do that.
Well, I've discouraged people from taking melatonin mostly because of its impact on some other hormone systems.
Right. But it's going to have huge impact. And the reason for that is, remember, melatonin controls autophagy and apoptosis. It's the only two change programs in mitochondria. So if you screw this endogenous process up, so the analogy that I give to people, if your body makes it, you're not designed to take it. It's equivalent to going and hiring a guy at the gym to do push-ups for you and thinking you're getting the benefit. That's the analogy I want you to understand. Now, the caveat is, as a physician, is there times where I'll use different substances that I would consider as a supplement? For example, the big one that I always get asked about is vitamin D. I don't want the lay public taking care of it, but I can't practice medicine on the internet because a lot of people ask me questions on Patreon and Facebook and Twitter. But I do tell them the reason why is what I just told you. When you take exogenous vitamin D, you're down regulating the production in your body. And that means you could be in good sunlight, say in Costa Rica or even in LA. But what doctors are reporting, my people are going out and getting a tan and their vitamin D level's not going up. What does that tell you? There's something else in the system. The photolithography that happens in wide-based semiconduction is broken at some level. It's your job as the decentralized clinician to figure it out. So why I think you're important, Andrew, for me, is I want you to understand my perspective so that when you hear me say what I say about supplements, you're beginning to understand that atomic organization inside the cell is really important to maintain. Why? Because if you want to know what evolution's really doing, it's that. That is the key. Like, DNA only works with 20 proteins. Those 20 proteins have been naturally selected in a randomized controlled trial called evolution. That's 4.6 billion years old. You don't have enough brain power to go against her. It's kind of like you waving your finger. That's how I look at it. So when you see me vehemently push back, say of a tweet or a podcast, or I'll say something on Instagram, I want you to understand I'm not doing it to be an ass. I'm doing it because I want you to understand the perspective. And I don't think anybody will really get it until they understand that we are creating light in us. And it turns out anything you do to alter the band gap of a semiconductor changes the frequency of light inside you. Mm-hmm. That changes the game.
So what things are on the fly list? I mean, I can think of a near infinite number of things that are on the no-fly list because it's going to disrupt these wavelengths of light, but within us and the way and all the downstream processes. But what are some of the things that are on the yes fly list? So, I mean, this is something that I'm sure exists on your blog and elsewhere.
Yeah, it does.
But
creatine is one that I'm okay with.
Okay. Yeah. But what about some of the more basic light viewing behaviors? I mean, is there a general contour to that you adhere to?
Yeah. So I tell everybody to make like the Sphinx. I mean, this was when I first got popular on the internet. I used to have a saying. I don't use it that much anymore, but it's very operational because you're new to me. I used to tell people, make like the Sphinx. All 4 extremities look to the east. That's why the Egyptians put it there. They knew something about light. The other thing is you eat like a great white shark. Protein and fat, avoid the carbs. If you're going to eat the carbs, this is where you and I are different. Eat them in the morning, not at night. And
I'm always willing to update. I eat them at night because they help me sleep.
Well, they will, but why? Because you're blue light toxic. And if I had an LED light here and checked your pupil, I could prove to you that I'm right. You know why? You're the neurobiologist, so I want to teach you this. Shine a blue light in your eye, and I have a red light, okay? Put the blue light in, your pupil doesn't constrict as much as the red light does. Right. You know why? Yep. The muscles in the cilia,
they express
they're dopamine. They're controlled by dopamine. Blue light destroys melanopsin, therefore it destroys anything tied to this mechanism I told you. So guess what happens? Their pupils stay bigger. But I can prove that it really works when I use a different frequency of light in you. So guess what I just proved? That you have melanin problems in your brain, hence the reason why you do what you do. That's the point that I'm trying to make to you. Centralized. Eddie Chang has never heard that in his life.
Explain centralized versus decentralized medicine.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. Centralized medicine is controlled by ivory towers, i.e. Stanford, UCSF, LSU, places that we're all from. I'm not trying to throw your institution on the bus. Mine is the same way. Decentralized is we use nature as our meter stick. Everything that nature says is axiomatically true, those particularly like E equals MC squared, the photoelectric effect, that kind of stuff, that is operational in you. Like you break that law, you got a problem. Why? Because evolution built a cell to be a dissipative, decentralized structure. It takes chaos of light and creates order. That's what it does thermodynamically. That is the flow of entropy. That is the study of circadian biology. So when famous paleo guys 10 or 15 years ago came out and said, food's the most important thing, and I kept doing the Instagram tweet, don't believe the book's cover, it's circadian biology. Well, you can see I wasn't very popular with those guys, but guess what? 10 years later, they're all dead wrong, and they know they're dead wrong.
And a lot of them are gone.
Yeah, well, of course they're gone, because you know what? They were selling half-truths, but hence this is the reason why me and you, dude, you're headed down the same path. And you know what? You're too good for that. I look at you as me, and you have a way bigger audience than Rob Wolf had, or, any of the other guys that are podcasts. Not only that, you're tethered to an ivory tower. But the most important thing that I see in Andrew Huberman is you have brains that you upload that are going to be doctors. And I got a big issue with that. That's like my number one issue. And I know that when you update your information with the stuff that we're sharing today, you're going to go, That's all I ask. I don't want you to become a disciple or a follower. What I want you to do, I look at the interaction between me and Rick when we first met. I lit a candle. I shared my flame with him. It cost me nothing. It cost him nothing. I want to do the same thing with you. But I want to do it more on the science side. I don't care if you like me. I don't give a flying shit.
I don't care if you care about... I believe you on that.
Yeah, I don't care if you have bad connotations about you. But I am going to demand that you listen to what I have to say because it's important.
Can I tell a quick story of the first time I ever saw Dr. Jack Kruse? It was at the very first biohacking event in Pasadena. It's about 10 years ago.
Well, that was Asprey's event, 14.
Yeah, in 2014. And it was 9 years ago. And it was a room, I would say there were about 400 people, 450 people, crowded. And Jack was speaking, and he spoke for about an hour, maybe 90 minutes. And it was enthralling. Everyone in the room was like hypnotized. And then someone said, okay, time limit, but he was still going, and no one wanted him to stop. So he's still going. And then eventually, Dave Asprey, who was running the convention, came in and he's like, okay, you have to leave now. You have to go. And escorted Jack outside. And everyone there, the whole audience,
400
followed
people.
Jack outside and just stayed with Jack for the rest of the day. And then
12 hours later, they were still in the restaurant across the street.
Yeah, I was one of those people. And Dave Asprey said to me, I'm never going to invite this guy back. He ruined the whole convention. Because everyone loved what you were saying and didn't want to hear anyone else.
Well, I mean,
Amazing.
I'm glad you brought this up because Dave is one of those guys that I look at my past. I don't want you to become Dave. You know what I'm saying? I don't think you're built that way because you're a scientist. Dave's a marketer. But this is when Rick brings the story up, at that event, there was medical students there, there was doctors there. They had a huge stage in Pasadena. The guy that was speaking had maybe 20 people in the room. He put me in the smallest room. The doors were open, people were hanging. And what was I teaching about? Stuff that we're probably going to talk about soon, which is paramagnetism of oxygen, how it works with mitochondria. And people were like, I never heard this shit before. And I tried to explain to him how it worked. But what Dave was really concerned about is that some of the products that he was selling out in the hallway, everybody knew from what I just said, this is a bunch of horse shit. And you remember what Dave's about. He's a profiteer. Dave is no different than centralized medicine. He brands himself a different way, but I want you to know that that's who Jack has problems with.
But I believe that Dave uses his products and believes that he may be wrong.
Oh, I agree with you.
I know he believes it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I think it's okay for people to be wrong. Well, I mean, you were wrong up until you were reborn.
That's what what extinctions are all about. I mean, the dinosaurs were right until they weren't.
Exactly.
Well, I believe in gleaning information from widespread sources. I do. I mean, growing up, I was always hurting myself. So then I got into fitness and I started reading about weight training and this kind of thing. And back then, I mean, do you remember when we, even 15 years ago, and certainly when I was in high school, the only people that lifted weights were football players or boxers, people who want to go to the military. And the only people that did yoga were yogis. Right now, there's a yoga studio, and my late 70s mother lifts weights, small weights, but she lifts them. Almost everyone now knows that you want to live longer, you want to be stronger, you have to do resistance training, and you can find yoga studios everywhere. What I've seen it over and over again. What used to be counterculture becomes mainstream. And so I think that within the realm of science and mental health, physical health, high performance, biohacking, whatever you want to call it, gleaning from multiple sources isn't just better, it's absolutely necessary. So the word that was coming to mind earlier as you were describing your trajectory into all of this and through this is the title of E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience, right? Correct. A beautiful word that I think means, a literally like a leaping together of ideas. Unfortunately, very few people actually read the book. And unfortunately, when I read the book, I got very little from it. My apologies to the great E.O. Wilson. But it's a wonderful word. And I think it well encapsulates what your experience has been, right? Of this leaping together of ideas across an enormously broad range from ultra reduction. I mean, quantum mechanics, all the way up to, evolution and history of multiple species, right? In the galaxy, right? So,
but it does, it spans, I try to explain to people that in order to get the true picture of life, you have to look at life like you see a diamond. Like we talked about a diamond before. Why I keep using a diamond as an acronym because it's carbon based. It's got a high wideband base, but you look at it and you look at melon and you go, these things are totally different. But they're not. They're made out of the same thing. The crystal structure is different. But the crazy thing is you're made out of the same substructure. So there's got to be something in a diamond and there's got to be something in melanin that actually, it ties to you at some level. So as a scientist, like I know Rick will do this as the artist, but I said something to him before we started all this. Medicine is a science and art. I think what I did as a neurosurgeon was focused on the science. And I think my opposite side of the brain always had this potential, but it's the art of medicine that the leptin prescription is based around. It's doing brain surgery without a scalpel that I'm more passionate about than when I do it with a scalpel. And that doesn't mean that I don't like doing brain surgery, because I do. I still do it to this very day. I find the brain incredibly interesting. And it turns out for me, patients, operations, diagnosis, MRIs, that's my experiment. Your experiment is in a lab. My experiment's on a table in front of me. And patients teach me every day, but I have to be open to the lesson. And what I found in centralized medicine, the way we're taught, is that we're not open to it. It's our way of doing things, and this is the way it goes. And what I found through my 60 years, that's not true. It's absolutely not true. It's the biggest mistake we're making in medicine. And I just look at you as a cosmic tool, because that's what you are. You're like a drumstick in 9-inch nails. And how you're going to hit the drum is important. And, you know, Rick is the expert that can tell you, you need to fix this. This is a problem. I guess what I want to do, because Rick brought you and I together, I want you to understand my perspective. I don't want you to like it or dislike it. I just want you to understand it, because I think when you understand it,
you can't unsee it once you see it.
Well, you put that in the book. But the other thing I really want to get to Andrew is that I know something about me that I know is in him. You're curious. Yeah. This has got to make you curious. You've got to sit back and go, especially as a neuroplasticity guy, Jack, you're telling me that freaking neuroectoderm is still plastic. Like, metastasis isn't what we think it is. Like, people that have melanoma, you know what it is? It's the melanocytes inside trying to go to the skin to get UV light. It's not what we think it is. It's exactly the opposite. And then think about the oncology literature.
They say put stuff on your skin to block that, and then you get cancer.
Well, the problem is if you can't make UV light in your cells, think about what I just said with Gerwich and the onion. That means mitosis isn't what cancer thinks it is. We make drugs in big pharma at the mitotic level to block it. That's exactly the wrong thing to do, because it makes cancer metastasize.
It's the opposite.
You got it.
It's the opposite.
And you said that. You said that in a podcast recently. You said, it turns out
it's the opposite.
If it's the opposite, do the opposite.
Yeah.
And when I say that, say if I said this to you on a podcast with no context, or I said it to Eddie, like when you guys were talking about Eddie and that Broca's erythema, I was sitting there going, man, once you know that melanin can move around, it makes total sense why Broca's area wasn't where it's supposed to be. Because the mitosis was broken in that area from the tumor. The tumor informed Broca's area, it's time to move. That is retained in your neuroectoderm. Your brain is neuroectoderm. Wow. You will never get that. Eddie Chang will never get that, Andrew.
Well, he might if you tell him.
But that's what we're doing today.
Yeah.
But
you're using him as an archetype. But
that's it.
Yeah, I think Eddie's pretty open-minded. I mean, he's out there trying to revise the story on how speech and language exist in the brain. I mean, basically he's, lesioning, seeing areas of the brain that
he's the neurosurgery version of Claude Shannon, if you want to know the truth.
Information
theory. That's what he is.
Could we do simple explanation of light, magnetism, and electricity as it relates to the human body?
Yeah. I mean, light, we are designed by evolution for visible spectrum light between 250 nanometers and 760.
And that's our power source that fuels us?
That's what you call in your book the source.
The source.
The source is that. The key thing is...
So the cover makes sense.
Totally. I said that to Chantal. When we looked at the book, I was like, you know what? You don't realize that is infinity in certain cultures, but it also is, to me, I see the eye.
That's what I saw too.
And I figured that you would, because you're a visual guy and that's what you cut your teeth on. But the story, so you get it. You look at an eye. You've looked at an eye multiple times. You ever asked a question? These are the beginner mindset questions. Why is the sclera white? Well, the answer is in the band gap. Why? Because what does white do? It reflects all light. Nature doesn't want light in your sclera. It wants it through the perfect black body radiator, your pupil, which is black. What do you know about black?
Absorbs light.
All frequencies of light. what does the anterior part of the visual system do? Focuses the light on the RPE. What's an RPE? Melanin. There you go. Okay, what does the RPE do from there? Focuses it on melanin in different tracts in the brain. In fact, if you look at the human brain, more tracts in the human brain are dedicated to light than anything else. Why aren't we talking about light? You said something to earlier that I think was brilliant. We have melanopsin everywhere. Why hasn't somebody in the ivory tower said, why in the hell do we have chromophores, blue light chromophores, everywhere in our brain?
I'll tell you, I don't know, but I know it's not a mistake.
I think it's because there's just no path, right? I mean, if it were shown that you could shine light in the brain, and by the way, if people are hearing this and they're thinking, wait, I heard about all these studies, MIT, Liwei Sai's lab, you shine light in the brain and you can alleviate some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's. In that is true in a mouse model. In almost all the experiments involving putting light into the nervous system that are done nowadays, they've introduced algaeopsins, channel rhodopsins, halorhodopsins into those cells, so they're not really behaving like our cells. No. What has not been explored, to my knowledge, is what the effects of amber light, purple light, red light, green light, blue light to neurons are in the absence of any other manipulation.
I'll give you a better one. Let's trumpet. Here comes the Ghazi Yassergo moment for you. Every single thing that you believe in a randomized controlled clinical trial, I throw under the bus. Do you know why? Every single thing you ever done in your life and every other PhD has been done under blue light. How does that? You have no light controls in your studies. So why do you assume? You just said out of your own mouth that the human brain has more melanopsin in it than ever. Melanopsin goes 435 to 465, and you've been studying them under 48 years under that light. Before you, guys that won Nobel Prizes. Like, now let's go after a sacred cow. Peter Mitchell, chemiosmosis. That is a Nobel Prize that should be rescinded.
I'm not familiar with that.
Everything that happens in a mitochondria. He's the guy that came up with the mechanism. It's a half-truth. But there's a guy that you don't know about who's also PhD named Gilbert Ling, who did studies in the 1950s and 1960s and said, if Peter Mitchell is right about chemiosmosis, it breaks the second law of thermodynamics, not by a little bit, 500-fold. Now, back then, we had no good way of counting up how much ATP is made. But Gilbert Ling did a pretty good job. And here's the funny part. Peter Mitchell got a Nobel Prize. Not one machine in biology has ever been made from his work. But from Gilbert Ling's work, guess where the MRI came from? That I use every day. Do you understand why I revere Gilbert Ling? He just died. He was 100 years old. Lived in Long Island, just so you know that. Without him, I don't get the best tool that I have ever had. That's like our new microscope in neurosurgery.
Mm-hmm. What's the use of... I suffered depression a period of time, and one of the doctors recommended this big magnet.
Transcranial magnet.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, Chantel and I use that in our TBI clinic. So it's kind of interesting. Light is an electric field and a magnetic field. The way the atmosphere works when the sun is out, electric fields are massive in the ionosphere. You have to look at the atmosphere, not the way everybody looks at it. Look at it the way a physicist looks at it. It's basically an ionic plasma. And it's just like the aurora borealis, except you don't see it, but it's there. And that's what terrestrial sunlight is. It's filtered, because remember, from the sun, you get the full range of electromagnetism, from RF to cosmic rays or gamma rays. The filtering prospect happens through the atmosphere to get there. So when light falls to us, it's 250 to 760. That's why the visible spectrum, what we're optimized to. Electromagnetic waves are photons. Photons are partially electric, partially magnetic. They're 90 degrees to each other. You can induce an electric current from a magnetic induction engine, which is exactly what you're an expert at. That's what the cochlea does. That's why it's spiral. It's got melanin in it. And when people actually learn really how hearing works, you hear light and turn it into sound. So
are light and sound just the same thing?
Well, no, they're waves, but they're not the same thing. Remember, this goes back to axiomatic rule of nature, E equals mc squared. What did Einstein fundamentally say in 1905? Energy and mass are the same thing. The only difference is the light. So realize, when I tell you guys, I use the fancy terms wideband semiconductor, and it makes UV light. On the surface, it goes kind of crazy, but as soon as you realize Jack's talking about E equals mc squared, you can create light from atoms. Like the semiconductor industry has been doing it since the 1950s. And it's amazing to me that these guys in Silicon Valley can do it, but me and Huberman, if we say it, we're kooky. You know, who's kooky, dude? It's everybody else. And not only that, when I come to Andrew and say, Andrew, because I knew he didn't know about Becker. Becker did the original work in bone to show that it runs a semiconductor current. It's not speculation. It's proven experimentally. It's published in the literature. Well, so then you got to ask yourself the question, all right, let's talk about the rest of the tissues. If it's working in bone, holy shit, this has got to be in a lot of other places.
Well, I want to talk about microbiome and light in the microbiome. Before we do, I just want to cue up a note, because we're talking a little bit about science sociology and context here and what's considered revolutionary, crazy, or acceptable. And recently, I think put a tweet out about this. There's something in neurons called ephaptic communication. Yep. So just to get people up to speed, there's most everyone believes that neurons release neurochemicals, dopamine, glutamate, GABA, et cetera, and they do, and that they communicate that way, and that those chemicals inspire more or less electrical activity in the neurons that they impact. So there's considered electrical and chemical communication. But for a while now, there have been papers coming out that are really inconvenient papers, frankly, but super interesting, that neurons can communicate with one another, not just through what's called synaptic communication, but also by the progression of electrical waves through multiple neurons, through mechanisms that are just not in textbooks. And it's always been, the papers come out, admittedly, they've come out in big journals, they've been top journals, but it's inconvenient, right? And so they tend to come and go. People go, oh, wow. And
Can you explain inconvenient? Because I agree with you, but I want you to say it in your own terms so the audience really understands.
Right. What this means, I almost want to say if it's true, but we know it's true, right? It's been published in top journals by top lab. We know it's true. What this means is that
it's an inconvenience to the truth that's in the textbook.
That's right. It means that the way that 99.99% of physicians and biologists and people understand that the way the brain works and cells in the brain communicate with one another is just one part of the story, that there's an entirely different route of communication. It will be a little bit like if I just said, hey, Rick, let's stop talking now. And Jack, let's stop talking. Let's just communicate by telepathy. Like, why are we doing this? And you go, well, we can't do that. But it turns out in the brain, this is kind of analogous to telepathy being yet another form of communication. So neurons can talk to each other at long distances without having to release these chemicals or through electrical signaling of the kind that you find in textbooks. And so what this is really saying is, yes, like speech exists. No one's disputing that. Sound exists, but it's also saying that, in some sense, telepathy, something analogous to telepathy exists. Now, this isn't telepathy, but what it means is that like the front of my brain and the back of my brain could be in communication through ways that can't be explained through textbook knowledge.
Why is the idea that telepathy may exist or has been proven to exist a bad thing?
I don't think anyone thinks it's a bad thing.
Pharma.
It's that it's very hard to do anything with until you understand more of it. And, the good news is it's been, and here I'm not talking about this ephaptic communication and things like it. You just need more scientists working on it. And once there is a critical mass, kind of like what's happened with psychedelics recently, once you get enough people within these big institutions working on it, then it becomes an accepted field.
But instead of inconvenient, why isn't it celebrated as like a breakthrough?
Because it makes it hard. I'll tell you exactly, in one sentence, it makes it very hard to teach undergraduates, graduate students, and medical students.
He's being way too generous here. It offends the profiteers of medicine. That's the truth.
So, here, admittedly, and I'm not playing dumb here, because I'm not a physician, I've never had to do billing charts, I've gotten grants and we still do that in my laboratory. I don't understand what that is exactly, like how,
but you need to,
the
because
profiteering of medicine is something that, of course, I know big pharma exists, and, I have insurance, and you get coverage and deductibles and all this kind of stuff. But I don't understand those models because I'm not a clinician.
It's very simple. If you understand the basics of what I'm saying, we can use light frequencies to replace drugs. In fact, Tina Crew, the person that we were talking about at lunch, she wrote a very interesting paper. If you want to look her up, TIINA Crew, Kuru. She wrote a paper. The title of it is Red Light a Drug Therapy? And after you read the whole paper, the last line is Tina Crew goes, I come to the conclusion that it is. So that means that every frequency within PBM, which is 600 to 1100 nanometer light, actually does something that big pharma has a pill for.
Is red light always the solution?
Red light is, I will tell you, it's the base. The one thing you need to know about red light is from the time the sun up to the time sun's down, red light is present. Now, here's the interesting thing. IRB, IRC, which is also in the solar spectrum, because solar spectrum goes to 3100. Like if you go to the desert, down where you're at, you can feel the rocks are still hot when it's 50 degrees out. So infrared light's there. So if you have the detector, but that's the basis of the reason why the Scandinavians who have shitty light like geothermal pools, because you're getting that effect. The reason why is because it changes the water chemistry in you. So before
if you go in a hot tub, will it do it, or it has to be geothermal?
No, but it'll work. But I will tell you, there's other things you have to do to really power up. Like say, I think it was at the event that you and I were at with Neil Strauss. There was a guy there with the soaking tubs, like, the sensory deprivation tubs. Mm-hmm. And I told him if he wanted to increase the effectiveness of this, he should add music, different types of music that affects the coherence in water, and red light. I said, if you do that, dude, that's a winner chicken dinner, because basically you just created a pod that a baby is in the amniotic sac. That's effectively what you're doing, because the mother's heartbeat is doing the same thing to that amniotic sac. We know that. The crazy part of the story, going back to neurosurgery, when you were talking about, that's the paper that I posted, that you can slice the brain up and you can still measure the waves after you slice the brain up. How did I learn about this a long time ago? When I actually did rotations in functional neurosurgery, that's what Eddie Chang does. We used to do subpial restrictions on the cortex. That's basically like taking a knife and cutting a gyri to stop a seizure focus, from generalizing other places. The funny thing is, it didn't work in everybody. And the reason it didn't work is for what you just said.
Haptic communication.
Right. And here's the other thing that we just found out you're going to like, is that every time an action potential happens in a neuron, do you know what neurons also release? Water, which goes to what he was just talking about. So I'm going to tell you about an experiment that's going to blow your mind. Again, published in Nature magazine. So we're not talking little one. Guy that won the Nobel Prize for HIV, Luc Montagnier, he just died. He found that DNA acts as a topologic insulator. That is a form of a wide-base semiconductor. He was able to take that DNA, put it in water, leave the water there, took all the DNA out, took the water, transmitted the signal, the electromagnetic signal in the water over the internet to another city in Europe, went into the water, and they were able to recapitulate DNA that was exactly the same. So guess what? You just said, is telepathy real? What if I told you the first paper is already published and it's out there, but you know why it doesn't get any traction? Because Andrew hit it on the head. When something offends biologists so much because it's not in their field, they ignore it. Or they make fun of it.
Tell me what the paper is.
I forget the name of it, but I can get it for you. It's been in so many of my blogs.
Yeah.
But he brought other people in. And the sad part is he just died literally in the last year. But he, huge believer, anti-Fauci. I mean, because Fauci was good friends with Gallo. Remember, Gallo tried to steal the Nobel Prize, but the Nobel Committee realized Montagnier was the ticket.
Well, one of the things that I've heard some of my colleagues say that I really support is that, when you're on a hiring committee for, say, neurobiology, and I actually think Stanford has done this well, to try and bring people from disparate fields into a field. If you're hiring a neurobiologist or you're hiring somebody in, immunology, a lot of times you pull from people that came through laboratories that very well because they're already in your field. But to really shake up a field and to really make ground, you want computer scientists, you want engineers, you want physicists, you want people that have enough understanding of the problem at hand, but bring a totally new perspective. And certain places have done more of that than others, but it is still very siloed.
It is.
And part of it is that it's hard to read the papers. Like if I read you were talking about your tweets earlier, right? Mm-hmm. So, and today I'm learning a ton, and and you said it yourself, that oftentimes people just don't have the skill set to be able to understand like what a free electron is, to be, let alone,
because of the silo that you came up in.
Yeah.
You don't have the basics.
And some of it's complicated. You got to know quantum mechanics to understand some of this.
I want to make sure that people understand the synonyms we're using, because you're good with words. I understand what he's saying, but I want to make sure the audience is getting this. Silo is a synonym for centralized medicine. In other words, this is what we believe to be true. If you ask a decentralized clinician, which I consider myself, I know that the truth is an approximation of the best data we have today. Therefore, it's subject to change.
Absolutely.
That's exactly the way I look at science. This is exactly the way I came to understand the leptin-melanocortin pathway and functionally how we really work as a semiconductive living organism that's a dissipative structure. The only time we're at equilibrium, because you hear that all the time in biochemistry, is when we have rigor mortis. That's the truth. Life is meant to live in the tail. So when you ask me, where did I come up with the black swan idea? That's where it comes from. It's a tail event. Mitochondriac, because I want you to focus in on mitochondrial DNA, not RNA and DNA, because that's not the story. The story in RNA and DNA is so simple to understand. It's 20 proteins. It acts as a topologic insulator. What does that mean in English? The outside can conduct an electric current, but it doesn't affect the inside the way it works. In other words, atomically inside, it's silent. Why? Because atomic organization at a molecular level is important. Why? All of biology is based on storing light energy at the electronic level. That means in bonds, in protons, in electrons. And it's our job as clinicians and biologists to understand that. We need to understand that science to help our patients. And when we're not, like when we have the epidemic of myopia, we have infertility, we have depression, we have schizophrenia, it's all discoverable when we understand what we're talking about. Why? Because proton tunneling changes how neurotransmitters work. When you put someone in a cold environment, do you know that it doesn't matter if their testosterone goes down? Why? Because the electronic nature of the wide-base semiconductor means it can still work at a testosterone level of 250 because the sensitivity of the receptor goes up. We don't know that in centralized medicine, but I know it. Why? Because I do it in patients all the time. You had it done when you were on the operating room table. When you told him, you're going to freeze my brain. Fine. Guess what? Freezing your brain has a lot to do with why the methylene blue worked. I told you at lunch, the reason methylene blue works, it's so simple. It changes the oxidation state of iron, which allows you to regenerate melanin. What else does it do? It actually delivers nitric oxide to the tissue that it's in. And guess what? That story is an evolutionary story that began before the KT event. Life has used that before. The last thing that it does, it improves proton tunneling. The only thing, what nature uses for proton tunneling, not to slip it in again, that's what the choroid plexus does in the brain. Choroid plexus is an ultrafiltrate, takes blood out of the circulatory system, makes CSF in your brain. Your entire semiconductor circuit.
What's
CSF? Cerebrospinal fluid. Huh. Your entire brain is covered with it, where all your key semiconductors are on the outside and where melanin is on the inside. And we have 4 ventricles in our head filled with it. Somebody's got to ask the question, why is CSF got the atomic organization that it does, and why does it concentrate iodine? I'll tell you the reason why. It's the Grothaus mechanism. You know what it does? Do you know that if you talk to any semiconductor electrician here in Silicon Valley, that they use iodine to dope graphene to make it a wideband semiconductor. Your brain got that message probably 3 billion years ago.
When you say wideband semiconductor, do you mean that it can generate? It's still fairly
light
narrow
stronger than the terrestrial spectrum of sunlight. That's what it means. Like
so,
silicon,
it has to do with the amount of energy present.
Well,
in that
photonic
light.
energy. So silicon generates 1.1 to 3.1 electron volts. I told you before, potassium, if you use that, because that's one of the atoms that's in a cell, 7.67 electron volts. So that takes you down to light that corresponds to 150 millimeter light. So all of a sudden you start going, so no wonder melanin is in the ear, because what good is putting melanin in the ear if it responds to all frequencies of light from RF to cosmic radiation if you don't have an element next to it that can create that kind of light?
Given the importance of melanin, I've been curious about albinos. So, it's not super common, but maybe there's information there.
There is.
So in your kind of classic albino, red eyes, white hair, and they have a mutation in the tyrosinase gene. So they can't make melanin. Given everything we've been talking about today, I would imagine they would have a lot more issues than just with their eyes.
They do, but guess what? Have you ever cut open a brain of an albino?
No.
I have. And guess what you'll find? They got some melanin, neuromelanin in their brain.
They maintain melanin
inside, not on the outside. People who are albinos tend to have a surface problem. But you'll also notice that they're a lot like people that don't have their eyes. They tend to die sooner of different diseases. It's very similar to the reason why tall people tend to die sooner. And that ties to the SCN. That goes to the other part of the equation we haven't talked about yet that you guys said you wanted to get into.
Superchiasmatic nucleus.
Right. It's because guess what it works on? General and special relativity. There's a reason that Mother Nature puts your major clock in your eye. And the reason why is because it stands furthest away from the center of the earth. So if you know what Einstein functionally said, he said that in order to get something to work, it has to jive. In other words, there's time relativity. So let me give you the simple answer. Rick, you have a cell phone sitting right next to your right knee. You know that cell phone can get you to and from a restaurant tonight. And even when you don't know how to go there, you have no earthly idea that Einstein's papers are built into that phone. And it turns out there is a satellite above us that Verizon owns that runs their program 38 microseconds faster than the clocks on the ground. That allows you to have pristine accuracy. That's special in general relativity. Your body has its pristine optical lattice clock in your eye. That clock has to run faster than every clock distal to it. So the clock right here in the big toe, that's running slower than that. We don't have a way to measure time differences that short a distance. But I promise you, someday we will, just like Fritz Popp measured what Gurwitch found, that with a photomultiplier, we can prove that all cells. Why do I know I'm axiomatically right? Because the theory of relativity, as far as I'm concerned, is well standing. It is the science that dictates the big cosmos. Quantum mechanics is the science that dictates the small cosmos. Where do they meet? How do they connect? Thermodynamics. That's in the middle. That ties them both together. And what do we know about thermodynamics? Size and shape determine thermodynamics, which brings us to the story of mitochondria. That's why the size and shape of the mitochondria matters. Turns out, one of the key things I haven't told you about the leptin melanocortin story, the leptin prescription, is I looked at myself, and you remember what the primary care doctor said to me? Eat less, exercise more. Turns out when I understood what I was finding, that it's exactly the opposite. It turns out that I'm thermodynamically not good. So I'm going to ask Rick the questions. Rick, when you sprain your ankle, does it get bigger or smaller?
Bigger.
Okay. When you have heart failure, say because your aorta is bad or your heart's bad, does it get bigger or smaller?
Bigger.
Okay. When a star in the sky begins to die and it becomes a red giant, does it get bigger or smaller?
Bigger.
So why do we think that people who get bigger from being smaller eat too much? Could it be that their mitochondrial engines are failing because they don't have enough melatonin to drive their programs. Sounds crazy, right? Until you actually think about it. Then you go, so how do we make melatonin? Well, what do you know about melatonin? Well, conventional teaching that I learned at LSU that I found was not true from Dr. Bazan's work is that most melatonin ain't made in the pineal gland. It's actually made in your mitochondria through respiration. That's been published in the literature now 5-6 years. So that means the theory of relativity actually is tied to melatonin too. It means where you're melatonin deficient, all those clocks, they're all going to be all screwed up everywhere. And this is the reason why most modern diseases, I'm talking about diseases from 1893 to now. Why? Because that's when Tesla ruined us with the AC power grid and the incandescent light bulb. Because we changed the frequency.
Tesla didn't want the AC. Didn't he want the
No, Tesla wanted the AC. Edison wanted the DC.
Oh.
And it turns out the reason why AC is really bad, and this is what people don't understand, modern people, as soon as you plug into anything into an AC, not only do you get electricity, but you also make another frequency of light, like RF. If you're a real idiot and you have Lutron shades in your house or a ceiling fan that spins, and you modulate the frequency, you just created an alien magnetic field for your cells to deal with. Huge problem. So all of these things have effects, and they're biologic effects. The problem is, since our tools of discrimination aren't like Gassiosagil, like I don't have the tools that I can take to surgery to measure these effects. But what did I have when I met you, Rick, and you called me up? I have knowledge that allowed me to explain to you how I can help magnetism, because that's the next question you asked me. Jack, tell me about magnetism. Well, what is built into the methylene blue biohack? Methylene blue functionally changes oxidation state of iron from +2 to +3. What do you need to know? You don't need to know a lot of fancy science. Oxygen delivers to mitochondria when it's +3. And the reason why is what we talked to Andrew before about. Oxygen is paramagnetic. What does that mean? It's drawn to things with a magnetic field. What is the ATPase? It's a Faraday current, electron chain transport. FO-headed ATPase spins because protons go in it and red light spins it. Okay? Creates a magnetic field. Now, when I first started medical school, nobody believed that. Now we have MEG machines where we put it in the room and we know that humans create a magnetic field. The problem is people in centralized science, they don't want to know about it. But my NFL players, the players that I take care of at TBI, I can make them better very, very quickly by putting a ring over their head and delivering magnetic flux energy to make their ATPase spin faster so they can create water and melatonin. And that melatonin can fix autophagy, can fix apoptosis so that they're able to sleep better, so that they're able to get better. But I still need to teach them the keys about making like the Sphinx, eating like the great white shark. They need to do that. I need them to build melanin back on the outside to suck it inside because of your work, neuroplasticity.
Is that why I sleep on a 200-pound magnet?
Yeah, well, Magnetica, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a unipolar magnet that helps you. Now, does it help as much? Probably while you're here in California, because you know I'm not a fan of this place.
Tell me why.
You don't.
People have been trying to get me to leave California. So,
well, the real reason, I'm giving you something to write down that you can research. We can get into it a little bit, but there's a theory out there called broadcast theory. One of the interesting things that NASA has found out that over the state of California, there's 3 Van Allen radiation belts. Everywhere else, there's only 2. The reason for that is UHF, VHF, because you guys are the center of Hollywood, radio, and everything else. You've created huge amounts of ions above you. Mm-hmm. That affects the plasma. So that's the reason why primary care doctors all on the West Coast, from probably the mountains on, in the medical literature, we've seen a lot. Why do people who even have tans can't raise their vitamin D levels? Because remember, they should be able to do that. Well, it turns out there's a physical block. I posted yesterday on Twitter something you may like. 1967, there's a paper out that showed that people's cholesterol levels went up when they didn't get any UVB sunlight. So if you think about it, Big Pharma is printing money off of statins. Do you understand why? Because non-native EMF functionally blocks the conversion of a cholesterol ester to 312 nanometer light. So that's the reason why everybody's cholesterol's up. So believe it or not, cholesterol is a marker for blue light or non-native EMF toxicity. Just the same way when I said to Andrew, let me look in your eye and see your pupillary response. In other words, dopamine controls that. But people don't even know that dopamine controls fiber type in muscles. It does. Shocking, right?
I did not know that.
All right, and that's what I'm saying. But when you see this and you go, wait a minute, dopamine's made from tyrosine or phenylalanine. This is a big deal. You know, when we talk about dopamine, we always talk about Parkinson's or something else. No, dude. This story is way bigger. Way bigger. Dopamine actually controls myopia in the eyeball. When you get myopia, your eyeball elongates. When the dopamine level is optimized by the RPE and light coming in it, you don't get myopia. This is the reason why all the kids in Asia have it. Why? Because they've had Samsung phones tweeting all day.
Yeah, we've known that the closer that an animal, human or other animal, sits to any object during development, the longer the eyeball gets.
Correct.
And it's called nearsighted because the light is normally focused by the lens of the eye onto the retina, sort of, let's say, to the chip or of your eye, if you will. But when the eyeball gets too long, that light is focused in front of where it needs to be. That's why essentially it's too near to the lens, nearsighted. At least that's a convenient way to remember it.
So you as a, because I know your appointment is into ophthalmology, I'm going to ask you this question because I don't know the answer. I'm assuming something. Tell me what part of the prism of light, the 7 colors in light, bend the most?
I'm embarrassed to not know, but I'd be more embarrassed to give the wrong answer.
UV light. Guess what the key thing is? Blue light. So do you know why myopia is so problematic? It removes the focus. Remember I told you the anterior central retinal pathway is a semiconductor circuit? Remember I talked about the story about Bose? What happens if you don't focus the light right on the semiconductor? You got it, my friend.
Diffuses.
So guess what? What is that called? In Rick's world, signal to noise ratio, not so bueno for things deep to it, which is your area and my area. Mm-hmm. Do you see how simple this is? When you...
Well, I do now that, excuse me, if I just keep reminding myself, and it's like, it's definitely today there's an of course bulb going off for me. Like, of course, like light is, we always say in circadian biology, I didn't say it first, of course, like light is the most powerful Zeitgeber, timekeeper, because temperature will shift your circadian clock, eating will change your circadian clock.
But social, you know why?
But light is the most dominant.
But I want you to know why. I know that you know this fact, but you know what I'm not satisfied? Cold increases the amount of UV light you create internally.
Yeah, well, that's the big one for me. I mean, obviously that's the one that I think that's going to be the huge one for everybody listening, no matter whether or not they understand any of the rest of our conversation, is that our cells can create light internal to our body. Right? That to me...
Melanin is the screen. Remember the analogy I used to you before Andrew showed up? That we can sit in a movie theater when we were older guys in New York, and we look at the light, and then we see the movie, and you look at the light and go, wow, there's a lot of information in that light, but you don't see the information there. You see it on the screen.
You're talking about the beam coming from the projector.
Yeah.
So like, how is everything in the beam?
Right.
So, doesn't make sense.
You as a non-science guy, when I leave here, my job is not only to satisfy you, but I want to make him curious.
Absolutely. Both.
I want you to know that's what melanin is. It's the screen. We're having a discussion right now of the projector and the light. And that semiconductor circuit that I'm talking about is the one that I stumbled in. It's the one that I thought was just about obesity. And it turns out it's about fucking everything.
Yeah. Tell me melanin's always the screen? Does anything else work as a screen, or it's only melanin?
Well, what did I tell you was the big semiconductor before the KT event? Hemoglobin. We haven't even talked about that sucker, but guess what? That was so powerful for your hack, and it's still powerful for your hack, because I want Andrew to realize what I'm saying. Why is my message so offensive to Big Pharma? The people that he knows and treats with schizophrenia or dopamine, he knows the pathway from the IPGCs affecting the habenula nucleus and mood. But what you need to realize, light fixes that. But you need to understand the process of what's broken in the light to fix it. You know, it's kind of like going into a physics lab in Stanford and screwing around with the mirrors when they're doing a double slit experiment. That's effectively what I'm saying to you.
Well, if melanin is the screen, what's the projector?
Well, the sun, of course.
Okay, but internal. Sorry,
internally, it's your semiconductors, like collagen. Okay, the number one semiconductor that we know from Becker's work is collagen. Collagen is the most common protein in the body. 70% of the protein inside of is collagen. It's triple helix.
Is eating collagen protein beneficial as opposed to other kinds of protein?
Not as much as the carnivore and paleo guys want you to believe. No. The single most important part, because a lot of people don't know this even in biology. Becker didn't prove this, but a Japanese researcher did, and Becker confirmed it. He was the confirmatory. Collagen is piezoelectric and flexoelectric. So you know what that means? You'll love this. Collagen actually transmit light waves into sound.
Inside the body.
Which is the reason why in your book, when you said the thing about the earphones, I want you to know what's in there. I told you that is a book about frontal lobes. And the difference between us and chimps is frontal lobes. Yeah. And I'm telling you, the innovation, he knows this. All the reward tracks are built into our orbital frontal gyri. What did that? Melanin inside the midbrain, where dopamine is, in the substantia nigra.
Yeah, just to call out that it's called substantia nigra because it's dark, nigra. Right.
It's filled with neuromelanin.
It's filled with melanin. Like, so in a slice of slices, if we were to look at slices through the brain, Rick, no staining of those brain slices or anything, just look at that, even without a microscope, you would notice two prominent like crescents down near the bottom of the midbrain. And you'd say, whoa, what are those dark things? That's substantia nigra. That's where the dopamine neurons are. Nigra, dark, because they contain melanin.
And when those go bye-bye, guess what you get? You can get Alzheimer's, you can get Parkinson's, or frontotemporal dysplasia, which Bruce Willis got. He has no idea that his film career is what caused it. The thing I want you to know, because these are your clients, this is probably maybe uncomfortable for you or not, I don't care. Most of your clients have a problem with the locus coeruleus and the nucleus accumbens. That's why they're all addicted. They're addicted to alcohol, booze, blue light, nightlife. They lose those dopamine cells there, and they don't have. Just think about Bedingfield from Linkin Park. Think about Chris Cornell. Think about our lead singer from Nirvana. Think about Jimi Hendrix. They weren't able to pull their melanin back inside to recapitulate, to restore it. What was the I don't want to say brilliance because that's kind of bad. But what was the wisdom of nature that I stole? I know that if I change your iron to +3, you would regenerate your melanin, your screen, so that the light that you were putting in, because you stopped wearing the sunglasses at night, you stopped blocking the sun, you stopped being the Rick Rubin before, you became a black swan. You started to do things that offended centralized medicine. And what did you find? You got better. And you know what? When I met you, I just patted you on the back and said, just do me a favor, tell as many people as you can. Because the only way I think we're going to get change, honestly, I think me and Andrew are hamstrung. I think we're the story of Achilles. Our tendons are cut. I think we're going to be muffled. But you inviting me here with him, for him to hear my story, because you already know a lot of it, now you're getting a lot more pieces. I've never told anybody what I've told you two today. This is the whole shit and caboodle. I want you to know that you have the power of regeneration in your hands. You have to get your frontal lobes out of your own way.
I have a regeneration question. Tell me about how regeneration on the planet works. So how it works with the food cycle, what we eat.
How old are you, Rick?
I'm 59.
All right, so Exxon Valdez, you remember that?
Yep.
Remember how bad it was?
Yep.
Remember the BP oil spill?
Yep.
How bad was that?
Bad.
Was it?
Don't know.
Let me ask you a question. What is oil? It's a byproduct of photosynthesis. Everybody who lives out here in California, you know, tree huggers.
So everything is solar.
Everything on this damn planet.
Not a lot of those left out here.
I know that. But what am I trying to get you to understand? When you get to the fundamentals, the reason why you can piss on the World Economic Forum and all the people that run California, at least the reason I do it, I know you two may not want to do it, but I want to offend your beliefs right now. Mm-hmm. I want you to know that oil is a photosynthetic process. You know what it is? It's the damn dinosaurs that died in the event that we're discussing.
It's stored solar energy.
That's it. You know what it is?
Everything is stored solar
Everything
energy.
is, but you like industry. You just joggled my mind. In industry, what is the carbon molecule that stores energy? Industry uses ethylene. Everything is made out of ethylene. Okay? Ethylene is a product of photosynthesis. So industry uses it. That's what your plastics are made of. That's what your book is made of. Half the stuff in this studio is made out of it. But we don't realize it. Well, guess what we do? We use carbon backbone to do the same thing. What is the entire food web? Like when I say to Andrew, is this true or not true? The entire food web on this planet is tied to photosynthesis. Like when vegans, which I know you used to be, say that, it's more ethical to eat animals. Why? Do you think plants don't have a DC electric current? Because I got news for you. Andrew Burr in 1921 found that all plants have a DC electric current, just like the neurons in the animals that you're eating. And not only that, we know that they actually feel. But that's not what they want to sell you.
And do plants and animals take sunlight and use it the same way?
Well, the systems are different. And this is why in your blog that I wrote for you, I always do this with my members. I show them a picture of hemoglobin and magnesium. And I say, look at these things. And when you look at them, again, I'm doing this to be curious. You'll notice the only thing different is the atom in the middle. So we're back to that story about semiconduction, aren't we? And you'll notice that iron is atomic number 26, magnesium is 12. So what's the difference? 14 electrons. On 14 electrons, you go from plants to animals. In other words, complex life works basically on 14 electrons.
And to answer your question, I mean, we breathe in oxygen and give off CO2. They breathe off CO2 and give us oxygen.
Remember this?
That's the simplest way I can explain the circle of life.
But also we eat animals. Animals eat grass. Animals digest the grass in a way that we can't.
Correct.
We get the nutrients in the grass through eating the animal.
Correct.
Yeah,
it's the circle of life.
Yeah, we can get a lot of essential fatty acids.
And then when we get buried in the ground, we feed the next round of grass.
Correct.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying to you, it's all about atomic reorganization. It's all about when you get rigor mortis, you fall to equilibrium, life has a plan for you. You will become something else.
Yeah, you become useful in a new way.
Correct. So the one thing I wanted to update you on when I said this before about mitochondria and photosynthesis, realize that both sides of that equation also make DC electric current. Both. So now we're back to Eddie Chang, aren't we? He puts a pulse generator in people's brains.
Poor Eddie. He's going to love this. He's
he likes the attention.
Yeah, no, he loves it. I mean, he's an architect.
You gotta remember something. He's my brother through profession.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He will love this.
But you are also my brother through profession.
Indeed.
Because what I want you to do, you're the Jim L. Khalili of the United States. The reason I mentioned to you at lunch, I want you to have Jim L. Khalili on. I don't need to be there. I guarantee you on the physics side, he will blow your mind when he talks about proton tunneling and what happens in DNA. He's done the studies. We know proton tunneling happens. But for me to have that discussion with you guys, you gotta understand water. We haven't even touched on water yet.
Before we get to water, I want to just zoom out a little bit and ask about mitochondria in a very simple way. Years ago, I heard you on a podcast. It was called Biohacking Secrets Podcast. This must have been almost 10 years ago. And you talked about the fact that long wavelength light can make it through the skin and get to red blood cells and mitochondria through the surface blood vessels.
Correct.
And I love this idea because I was like, okay, great. Because now we're talking about talking about extraocular photoreception.
Correct.
And I like a rebellious idea. And because I was taught there is no extraocular photoreception.
Right. That's centralized medicine 101.
And I think the field of biology and chronobiology has come around a little bit. Like people are all hyped again about cryptochromes. In the race for melanopsin and trying to figure out what's the critical opsin for setting the circadian clock in the eye. Rick, it was like people were like, it's cryptochromes. In the end, Iggy Preventio was right. We have frog skin in our eyes, basically, and it's melanopsin. But that doesn't mean that there isn't extraocular photoreception. So my question to you is, if I go outside at, let's say, 9 a.m. and the sun is out, and I'm shirtless or sleeveless, what is the difference in impact on my mitochondria compared to when I go out in the evening, say around 4 p.m. This time of year where the sun is headed towards setting?
This is when you have to be a little bit more of a physicist or a light engineer. You guys, he probably knows these people well, and it would be good for you to get him on the podcast. 9 a.m. light is 2,700 Kelvin light. Light that happens at, say, dusk, 1,200 Kelvin. Is that the same? See, you know the number's not. Now you got to ask yourself, okay, let's talk about frequency, because what is all color? All color is frequency. And I'm going to tell you what I've told you today. All color is band gap width. You change the band gap width, you change the frequency.
So the thermodynamic effect is different at two times a day.
Totally different.
Do you have to be in the sun all day to get all the benefits?
No, because remember what the hippo and lion teach us. When they've had enough, what do? They go under a tree. What do? We put sunscreen on. That's horrible. You remember when the lion goes under the tree, I'll ask you this because you're the expert in vision. Do they still get the color temperature through their eye? Damn straight. Mm-hmm. Do you do that when you got sunglasses on? What happens if the lions ever put sunscreen on their mane? Do you know that when you put lions, this is also in the blog post I wrote you, when you put lions in the zoo, do you know what happens? They lose their hair and their melanin. Did you know that?
Wow.
Same thing I told you about the lady that I did the hack on to figure this out. It happens in zoo animals.
Explain the hack, because we were at lunch when you did
the hack is pretty simple. I basically took everything that I put together with the leptin prescription. I realized I could fix myself. So what did I do? The first time I started to eat like a great white shark, nothing but fat and protein. I cut carbs down to about 25 grams a day, and I saw the sunrise every single day, because one of the things that was said in The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, that it struck me. I wrote it down just like I wrote a lot of stuff in Rick's book. We see 25,000 sunrises in a lifetime. And I thought to myself, you guys have the ability to talk to the lady to my left. How many sunrises do you think I saw in residency? And just so you know, my OR in Charity Hospital had a window. We used to listen to Metallica with the sun coming up and going down, but it's behind glass. I realized in that moment what did me in. It was my job. And I'm always on trauma call. And I'm going, dude, I'm a blue light baby. I never get UV and I never get infrared A. And have you ever been in the operating room and looked at the thing that I want you to do, since you have a great podcast, I want you to start going around when you go to Rick's house, you go to Jack's house, Jack Dorsey, whoever you go visit, guys from Google, Stanford, go with a spectroscope and then ask them, tell me what's wrong with you. Okay? You can text me. And I'll tell you, Chantel, this is before we were together. She was married to her ex-husband. She had a guy that he worked with who had Parkinson's, and she contacted me. She goes, Jack, I know you can help this guy. And her husband shut her down. Didn't want for me to give him the information that can help him. This is not just a proxy story personal. This is what happens with doctors. That's the reason why he's important. Huberman is important to me. He needs to understand my passion. If you guys are sitting here, nobody's watching the video. I'm like Italian with you guys right now. I'm talking to you with my hands.
Love it. Indeed.
You see what I'm saying?
That's great.
And when I tell you
what you're saying, there it is.
I am very passionate about this. I think the reason why maybe I've resonated with Rick, I'll let Rick talk about it. He knows when I talk, like when you're in front of somebody and you hear it, it's just like what he does with music. The White Album was the shit for him. But guess what? He took the White Album and he could get Metallica all the way to Adele. And he can still optimize it. Why? Because the melanin in his ear is optimized for what he does. What's the melanin in me? It's my brain. I don't care about anything else, Andrew. I only care about my brain. Why? It's my superpower. I can think. The single most important thing to me is critical thinking and curiosity. I don't care about anything else. And I would tell Rick this. From my ability to think and my curiosity, that's where my creativity comes from. I'm a neurosurgeon who focuses on science, but I am developing in the last 20 years the art of medicine. That is brain surgery without a scalpel. That is the story of the leptin melanocortin pathway. It's the story of neurobiology. It's the story of neuroplasticity. It's retained in our melanocytes. It's still in our white blood cells. POMC is in the outside. POMC blocks UV light from the nucleus of a white blood cell that allows it to migrate.
The artist notices what no one else notices, but everyone can see.
Correct.
That's what you're doing.
And you know what? That I would say, I've heard everybody who's read Rick's book. To me, it's amazing. I don't think I said this to you. I told Rick one of the things I think he should do, because I did it for him. If you read what he wrote me in the first page of the book, He said, Jack, this is my experience. Tell me what yours is. So what did I start doing? I wrote my experience on every page. And my plan is when I'm done, I'm going to send Rick the book back. Because you know what I want, Rick? You know what what I would like to see the rest of our lives together since we're the same age? I want Rick to become a scientist. I want Rick.
He's hanging out with a lot of scientists
But I
lately.
want Rick to sit down and say, so Peter Adia, you just did this last podcast. Tell me how that affects band gap conduction.
There it is.
You know? Or when he looks at a Rothko, and you've talked about this in the past because you're into that. I want you to look at a Rothko next time and go, now I see something different.
Mm-hmm. Well,
this is a part of art that I didn't see. And you know what? You know when you get excited? When you see something that you've never seen, dude, that is passion. It just oozes out of you. You want more.
It is so exciting when you see something like that.
Yes.
And it gels and becomes clear where you can't unsee it again. It's like your life has changed. It's so exciting.
That's what I say, Rick. I mean, I think about this in other aspects of my life that are, not science. I told you at lunch that I like to collect misfits. The people that mean something to me, Andrew, most of them don't even know why. It's kind of emotional to me. I went through a divorce. It's not because I didn't like the person. It's because she didn't value what you and I and Rick are talking about today. And she did things completely opposite what I would have wanted her to do. And I knew that I couldn't change her. We talked about that earlier, and I tried for a long time. But then I realized that I had to worry about my daughter and my son. And you have to show people who are doing the wrong thing what life is like with you not in it, to get the message. And not that I'm going to go into all the story because I'm sure she'll be pissed off at me if I do, but let's just say I was validated after the divorce because things that happened shouldn't have happened. And even though we're divorced now, we're entangled through my daughter. I don't want my daughter to go through the same thing because what if I told you my wife's mitochondrial DNA is in my daughter, and I know that. I can't unsee that anymore.
I'll tell you, even if you didn't have a daughter, you'd still be entwined. It's just the nature of the way it works.
Well, I agree with you. I think we are entangled. I mean, that's why Chantal held the picture up to you before about entanglement. We are, but I mean, you and I could probably agree more on this than him. Quantum entanglement through water is the key. One of the things that physicists like Schrodinger couldn't accept, they could never figure out, how could you be entangled in a warm, wet environment? That's like a big problem for physics until you understand the chemistry of water. What does water fundamentally do? When it changes its bond angles, it basically controls the atomic organization of everything inside a cell. Then you start thinking about it. Where is water created in a cell? Cytochrome C oxidase. And then you look at cytochrome C oxidase with, atomic precision, and you see it's got 4 red light chromophores, 620, 680, 760, and 860. Chantal can tell you, what are the frequencies that we program into the bed to everybody that comes in to see us? Those 4. And if you got a brain problem, I'm going to hit you with 1535. Why? Because it controls proton movement in your mitochondria. So how did I figure all this shit out that I just told you? Through hacking it on me in this leptin prescription. I figured out what was moving. I read physics papers. I read some of Tina Cruz's work. I read Michael Hamlin's work at Harvard. I went even deeper. I did exactly what Gassi Yastergill did in neurosurgery. I learned the lesson in neurosurgery to look smaller, to find the answer.
Well, but as I mentioned before, it's beautiful because you're linking it up, those tiny things across, huge scales of time.
Oh, isn't that what Einstein did?
Yeah, you have to, I do believe that in order to understand the nervous system or any system, you have to look in space and time, right? I mean, our brain functions so differently under.
But you realize that space-time is plastic. You're a neuroplasticity expert.
Yeah,
Think about it. We are beings on this planet. Each one of us deform the fabric of space-time. Some of us deform it more than others.
I have a question. I'm going to just briefly frame it in an experience, and I'll make the I promise it'll be very brief. When I started my lab, I decided to give myself a gift, which was to start working on cuttlefish, which are cephalopods. So they're like squid, octopi, you know, and people are obsessed.
A lot of polyphenols in them.
Yeah, amazing little creatures. And I was interested in a problem that's not relevant now about how they actually translocate their eyes. They swim around with their eyes on the side of their head, and they're very passive. When they see something they want to eat, their eyes translocate to the front, and they literally become depth perception machines. And that poses an interesting problem for the visual system. Anyway, what's perhaps most interesting and captivating about cuttlefish is the presence of chromophores on their body. You see these as they get hungry or they experience different things. You see these waves of chromophores. It's easy to see online, and it dazzles us. Is what I'm observing in terms of the waves of chromophores on the cuttlefish something like what's happening inside our body when you are saying that our nervous system, because basically they are a nervous system they have the cuttle bone, but without a skeleton. Is that what's happening inside me all the time?
I can already tell you that Rick was successful. You finally understand Jack Kruse. Because you know what?
You love cuttlefish too?
Well, I will just tell you that cuttlefish were part of what made me understand this, because don't you think it's a little bit ironic? Remember how we said that nature never makes mistakes? Mm-hmm. What do we call it? A cephalopod. What are you?
Of the head, cephala.
Right, cephalo. So guess what? The same thing is going on in your brain. You know what the difference is? On the cuttlefish, you get to see all the changes in light occur, but in us, you don't.
Why? On
Because
the
think
inside.
about where they are. Mm-hmm. No, but it's not just the inside. Even when remember, I'm the guy sitting at this table here
with them open
that opens them up. You still don't see them when you open them up. I can promise you that. Chantel will tell you. She's been in enough brain surgery with me to tell you. But is light emitted? How do we know that? We know that from Becker's work. Why? Because when he took apart the semiconductor circuit in bone, he found out the P semiconductor, it glows brown red.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is important. And I do think it's an important point of resonance here, because that cephalopods are basically a little swimming brain.
Correct.
Without a skull around them.
Or without fancy epigenetic toolbox that we have.
Right.
In other words, that allows us to take it. If you want to, I'll try to explain this to you where you're at. Because the step you just made for me, I know I'm hitting you. I know I'm hitting you good. They don't have the screen in the movie theater. They emit the light. Mm-hmm. So they are like the light. They're missing the wideband semiconductors. So the reason why they're simple little creatures is because they have no way to capture the information in light.
Well, the reason I started yes, and the reason I started working on them is it occurred to me that there is no other organism that I'm aware of that with current technology I could look at, change something in its environment, make it eat or, watch them fight or have sex or whatever, and get a picture of a two-dimensional physical picture of what is going on in the brain, because by looking at the cuttlefish, you're looking at the brain.
But there is. And see, the thing is, this is your power of observation as a scientist. Remember how I used the term, and I didn't want you to take it derogatory, myopia. I know that that's not true sitting here talking to you. And you and I don't know each other well. You know what a chameleon is. You've mm-hmm. seen it. Mm-hmm. They do the same thing. Mm-hmm. How about a iguana in Mexico? Changes. I got a better one for you. You're interested in circadian biology. Do songbirds not change their song? Mm-hmm. Do they not change their feathers when they're breeding? Rick waxed poetically about songbirds. What did they do? They changed the frequency. This changes everything. That changes the receptors and the hormones. That's what breeding's all about. There are certain times to breed on Earth and not. People don't even realize, like I wrote in your guys' blog that I wrote for you, like very provocative stuff because I want you to get it. Tryptophan and methionine, you know what they fundamentally are from a physics standpoint? They're time crystals. When light hits them, they resonate differently in different times of the season. So, for example, if you look at the catabolism of tryptophan, you'll notice that it can be metabolized to a ketone or to a glucogenic amino acid. That should strike you and say, why is that? Turns out cold makes it get catabolized a certain way. What controls that? The semi-band conduction and the light show that you're talking about from the cuttlefish. So when you then extrapolate this idea and you go, so is this what DNA is doing? It's the master conductor. It's the Rick Rubin of the cell. well, maybe not the Rick Rubin. It's the James Hatfield. It's the Lars Ulrich. It's the reason why in the back of the Quantum Engineering 29 blog, I wrote the story of me, him, and David Wolf sitting at a table when he told me the story about Metallica's drums and AC/DC's drums. And I so much wanted to tell Rick the answer because he was like, I know this, but I don't know why. And I knew why.
When earlier you said that's the source. And I want to go back to that because a lot of what's brought Rick and I together as friends.
Tell me what that is. I'd love to know.
Like that.
How did you guys entangle first?
Rick had heard about me, I think, through the podcast, and we started FaceTiming during the pandemic.
I met you before I ever heard the podcast. I can't remember how though.
Yeah, I think we
a
started
mutual
FaceTiming.
friend. I think.
Yeah, we started talking about ophthalmology and vision, and then health, and then life, and then our first in-person meeting. Went to his house and sat down in the sauna, and I kind of split open on what was going on with me personally, and he was like, yeah, like, okay, he was a great help to me then and continues to be. And
he's a collector of misfits too. and he connects us. And that's the other thing he really does. Exactly. He's a connector.
And I love
They have a name for that in Yiddish, but I can't think of what it is.
and I love his stories. And so I started asking him stories about musicians I love and things that I love. But we've talked about, or he's mentioned, the source. Like, I'm obsessed with energy. And because, caloric energy is interesting, but it's not nearly as interesting to me as neural energy. And today we're, in the back of my mind the whole time, I realized, like, we're talking about neural energy. What do I mean by that? Well, yes, we have stored energy as fat and protein and stuff in our body, but
those are like ethylene. Those are like ethylene.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Yeah. What I'm interested in is what creates that feeling of, like, yes, that, more of that. The stuff that creates bonding between people. The
dopamine.
Stuff,
Dopamine is. Yeah. I can tell you from
I've always thought that chi and dopamine are sort of synonymous with one another.
I think they are, but I would tell you, this is the reason why when I meet people, like, I have to give Chantal a lot of credit here. For her, I am very happy that she pushed me to do this. But I think seeing your face, like, my opinion of you is radically changed. You are more open than I thought you would be, but seeing your face, I don't have a photo multiplier, but I do. Like Rick says, he uses that famous thing about he's the invisible coach. And I tell people that I'm the visible coach that can explain the magics of the invisible, because that's really how we're entangled. And he does it through music. I do it through biology. I want people to understand this. But when I see you, on my website, on my forum, I have a rule. You got to put a human picture up. Now, it sounds stupid on the surface because it's blue lit. But you know that there's a part of the brain that has face-forming things. It's important. I want to know that I'm talking to a real person, because what I'm trying to do is make it more real, like we're doing right now. We are sharing communication through words. Rick has been beautiful in his book saying words really are a myopic way to do this. We talk to our hands. I mean, our toenails, our fingernails. If you saw it in the photo multiplier, they're amazing. You know what emits the most light in the human body? The tongue.
Really?
Yes, that's why we kiss, and that's why we perform oral sex. Kid you not. The glands of the penis, the clitoris. This is the reason why we are creatures of light. Like, when guys like neo-Darwinists like Dawkins come out and talk shit about, the Bible, you know what I always tell? I tell my members this all the time, because I'm not really a religious guy. I'm more of a spiritual guy. I tell people that everything in Genesis from 1:1 to 1:10 is absolutely true. I said, you know what the problem with religion is? They told you it's about light, but they didn't give you the recipe. I really believe that I'm on this planet to talk about that recipe. And I want to infect as many people with this virus that I have as I possibly can. That's what I want. I don't care what happens to me. I just want to make sure that it doesn't die with me.
That the information lives on.
Right.
I really understand that.
Yeah. I've had colleagues pass away, and you just go, shit, like, I wish we could have just like downloaded their brain.
Right. Well, but you can. And the thing is, I hope you look at podcast differently from today on, because I think When Rick does music, he does this. Like I made the comment before, and I think people listening to this don't understand. I was being literal and figurative. Rick is a master tape of all his dopamine collection through his ears. He sees the world, not just through his ears, because that's not fair to him. It's clear he sees it other ways too. But I think that Rick is a much better artist since he's now using his eyes and took the sunglasses off. Since he's using his skin, I think that he has now more channels to which help Eddie Vedder, Metallica. Not only that, do I think he can help guys that he sees struggling with some of the things that we're talking about now because he knows they may be a better musician. Now, there's a flip side to this that Rick pointed out in his book. Just because they're impaired doesn't mean they're bad. I mean, Jackson Pollock is a perfect example. I mean, look, he painted, everybody thought it was amazing. But we found out like 5 years after he painted his best painting, it's by fractals. And the only way we knew that is because all of his alcoholism and drugs destroyed his frontal lobes. So he actually saw the world like Mandelbrot science.
It's like the Chuck Close thing too.
Correct.
His
it's just
brilliance
amazing.
Came from his deficit.
Right.
Quotes. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of amazing. You know, there's stories out there that things happen to people. Like I've seen my own personal opinion. One of the most amazing cases that I've seen in my neurosurgery career, I had a guy who was a soccer player get hit with a soccer ball, get a concussion, and then be able to speak a language with a different tone. I've had another person from a car wreck, I told Chantel about this, in Nashville, who became able to play the piano. Never played the piano before.
Wild.
And I sat there, and it stunned me. But I'll tell you the biggest revelatory story. I've only told this, never said it publicly except on Clubhouse in a Bitcoin room. But neurosurgeons, we deal with big time trauma. So we deal with brain death a lot. And I'm a big believer in trying to get families to donate organs. And I've been very successful at that. The reason why is I have no problem talking about death to anybody, because to me, I look at it just like you look at breathing. And I think it's important. So the story went, and this happened in Tennessee when I was in Nashville. It's a long time ago, but it's happened to me 2 other times in my career. I got a young kid, 18, 19 years old, his family to donate his organs. And the way it used to work, we would get a letter letting us know where all the organs went to the different people. No data, it was HIPAA stuff. But you knew that this person got eyes, this person got a liver, this person got the heart. And they don't give you names. They just tell you a little bit about the narrative of their story, like their history of present illness. So 6 months later, I get a lady show up to my clinic who doesn't have a neurosurgery problem. She just wanted to come talk to me. And the office girl's like, we don't know what this is about. She comes in and she says, look, she goes, I don't know who to ask. I've asked my primary care doctor. I've asked everybody else. She goes, ever since I got this heart, I have this intense desire for McDonald's French fries. And I looked at her and I said to her, I said, why did you come see me? And she goes, well, I thought since you were involved in this somehow, that maybe you would know something. And I just sat there stunned. And I didn't know what to say to her. She had no way of knowing this. The data is not out. You can't get this information. It's kind of like adoptions that are closed. The kid died at a McDonald's drive-thru in a car, plowed into him in a T-bone.
Incredible.
And they found McDonald's French fries in the seat next to him. He was eating the French fries when the accident occurred. This is a lady who never ate potatoes. Now, Andrew, the reason I'm telling you this story, as a neurosurgeon, there's nothing in our textbooks that can explain this. But the quantum coherence of water and the story about Luc Montagnier can. That happened before Montagnier ever did his experiment. I always believed that lady. Now, it's happened 2 other times in my career since then.
Now, I didn't know any of this when I fell in love with your work. Now I understand why.
I have a question, and it's a Rick stepping out for a moment, but even though it might not be optimal for light viewing behavior, what are your thoughts on the fact that both you and Rick are from New York. I mean, he's from Long Island. You're from New York City, but it's come up several times today. And you know, I always have wanted to live in New York City. I went there when I was a kid, 5 or 6 years old, and was like, this is the most exciting place on earth. I just cannot.
It is.
And to this day,
but I will not go back.
I can't believe that it exists. It's like one of these things where the way I think about it is, have you ever done any like snorkeling or scuba diving everywhere you look in a tropical coral reef, there is life.
Correct.
Like at every scale. You could spend, I could spend an hour looking at like one little square millimeter of coral, and you'd see change all the time.
But do you realize that you just described why Rick wrote the book? I mean, I listened to part of your podcast with Rick, and you said that you had read the book 3 times and it's had a huge impact on you. You don't realize that what you're seeing there is the experiment that Rick went through in New York, just like I did. Our dopamine level spans schizophrenics to depression.
Well, this is the thing too. I mean, do you think growing up in New York is, I mean, it seems to me it's a perfect ecosystem for a nervous system to evolve in.
But you can't stay there because guess what? It's the ideal place, just like California is, to degrade your melanin sheets in your head. See,
so this is what I was saying. New York City seems to me like this incredibly powerful way to shape the nervous system, which it did for both of you guys. I mean, I foraged into San Francisco, went to New York pretty young. I got involved in a bunch of different subcultures early on, but I listened to people who grew up in New York, in the city or near the city, and then left New York, and their vitality and their energy and their curiosity is extraordinary.
Yeah, New Yorkers, I will tell you, I've always said, and I will say this, I hate California. In fact, I told Neil Strauss 2015, it's the last time I'm coming. I hate it. Why? Everything that can go wrong with the leptin-melano pathway happens here. But
despite the ample sunlight?
Yeah, well, the ample sunlight's not good enough. We already know that. I mean, that's the reason why so many Californians are walking around with vitamin Ds that are below 30. So that's when you have to be curious as a clinician and say, why is everybody walking around here with low voltage? Well, it's because you live in a place that doesn't allow the transmission of light to your melanin sheets. Guess what? The same thing's true in New York now.
What we don't want to send everyone these places, but where on the planet are things closer to optimal?
Well, I mean, if you were understanding, remember I gave you +5 about the cephalopod?
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going to give you -5. Where'd the asteroid hit?
You said it was down near the Yucatan?
Yucatan Peninsula.
Yucatan, yeah.
There's a 166-mile hole in the Gulf of Mexico. Knocked out 50 miles of land. You know what that puts you closer to? Magma. We just found out 4 years ago, there's actually a volcano on the bottom of the Gulf. What do you know about magma? It's iron that flows, right? Electromagnetism. Huge magnetic field. Magnetic field there is stronger than it ever is. What do you know about Mars? It's a dead red planet with no magnetic field. What do you know about Earth? It's got a molten core that keeps flowing. Where that thing hit, anything around there, anything in the Tropic of Capricorn and Cancer, where light is stable. Remember, this whole podcast is a story of light. Light stability in physics, planetary physics, happens between those zones. So if you're at 0 latitude, all the time you have 12 hours of darkness, 12 hours of sunlight. When you move away from that, 20th latitude is Cancun. That's where the cenotes are. At the equinox, when it's the day is longest on the 21st of June, you know how much you lose? You get 12 hours, but when you get, I should say, December 21st, you only lose 46 minutes of sunlight. So if you really understand what I'm saying, the more light you get from the sun, the more healthy you become. See, Peter Attia just did a podcast, and I know you're influenced by this, but I'm going to say this to you to flummox you again. Peter and you believe that having all these big muscles and being strong is really important in longevity. If that's true, then explain to me why Nir Barzilai's clinic in Albert Einstein in New York has these little old Jewish guys that are all super centenarians that don't look like that. Why doesn't anybody who's 100 years old ever look like Michelangelo's David? I'm going to tell you the answer because it comes from Doug Wallace. Humans don't bury their mitochondrial capacity in their musculoskeletal system. They do it in their brains and their hearts. So you know what the single most important muscle is? Your heart. which gets right to the very fact where we are at Rick. So I would disagree vehemently with you and Peter that strength is the key to longevity. No, I think your heteroplasmy rate in your mitochondria here and here is the single most important thing if you're a human. Now, if you're a gorilla, I will agree with you and Peter. Because they bury their mitochondrial density, hence the reason they look as they do. But what did we do from gorilla or ape to us? We shortened our guts, expanded our brains. We also lost our muscles. Why? Because what is energy in life? It's a zero-sum game. All we're doing is shifting the poker chips around. That's effectively what's happening. And this is also corroborated, and I'm surprised Peter's made this mistake because I am calling this out as a mistake. Humans die of brain and heart diseases, number 1 and number 2. It's not even close. And he's a doctor. He should know better. Nobody's dying of musculoskeletal diseases.
Well, I think he would say that cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease are going to be the major killers.
Well, but the reason why he's saying, this is what I'm trying to get to you, Andrew. The reason why he's saying is the wrong reason. It's the reason why he missed the methylene blue story. He doesn't understand mitochondria as well as you think.
So if the key location is the brain and the heart, what are the ways to charge and increase the density of mitochondria in brain and heart?
Take a look at your friend Rick. How does his solar panel look? That's good. How you do it. Melanin brings the sunlight in so that the melanin semiconductors inside him are regenerated. Effectively, what Rick's done in Costa Rica and Hawaii is the melanin renovation prescription. If you want a synonym for the leptin prescription, there you go. That's what it is.
How much time a day are you spending outside in the morning, Rick?
Probably about 90 minutes on a walk in the hot sun. You know, it's latitude 9.
And realize with Rick's story, because he said we're allowed to talk about it, because I want you to get the gist of it. His aortic valve in his aorta, thoracic level, trashed. What did I know about that? Melanopsin is present in blood vessels. Rick used to wear sunglasses, never got sun. So Rick's ears were maintained. But what did he cook in the RPE as it spun? Cardiac plexus. What do you know about the cardiac plexus? Got any melanin in it?
I'm guessing it does.
You got it. That's what Rick did in. That's the part. But it doesn't mean Rick's heart's bad.
I also slept completely opposite of the planetary rhythm. I wouldn't leave my house until 5 o'clock when the sun set.
Right.
And then I would come back home as the sun was rising, and then I would sleep all day.
How many years did you do that?
From college till I changed.
Because that's music industry.
Yeah, that's
the
rock and roll. That's the rock and roll schedule.
But that's all she just said it. It's true. That's what doctors and nurses do. That's the reason why in the nurses' health study, you see the effect. You want to see something interesting, Andrew? Go into the ICU at Stanford after you do this podcast with me. You'll see that every ICU nurse is a fat ass. You know what they do? They sit at night. It's night nurses. You got to go on night. They sit in front of a blue lit screen from an EMR, get radiated and artificial light all around them all night. And they're up at the wrong time. It's blatantly obvious.
Well, air traffic controllers at night, same thing.
But guess what? The other ones that are bad, pilots. How about doctors? Doctors never killed themselves. When I was young, I told you I used to be a dentist. I was an oral surgeon. I would never forget this in dental school. They say, yeah, you guys kill yourself more than anybody else. Now it turns out doctors do. Doctors are burning out at record rates. Guess why? They took our charts away that we write, and now they make us use EMRs to satisfy corporate medicine.
How do you, can we put a reasonable explanation around this statistic that I think is true? If it's not, let me know, which is that the greatest percentage of suicides occurs as days start to get longer. So April is the cruelest month.
It is.
In the Northern Hemisphere.
And yeah, you have to qualify which hemisphere it is, right. But it is absolutely true. And the reason why, do you realize, remember we talked about light stability before and latitude? When you realize we talked about the KT event, this was a photosynthetic event, meaning we got rid of UV light. We're doing the same thing with our own light. So what am I asking you to realize now in your own mind? This is a time scale. Remember I told you about space and time? Today's mammals, the most complex one with the most unbelievable epigenetic toolbox and melanin in them, now have invited their own KT event. It's called the modern light. And what else has technology done? Technology has brought us from outside in. I mean, technically, we should be doing this podcast outside. We could do that if we could open up all the windows. But the point I'm trying to make to you, we don't look at it like that. Like, here's the other crazy thing that I go against the Darwinists that I want you to hear clearly. Don't you find it amazing that all the Neolithic diseases that we have in the last 100 years showed up since 1893? You realize that Alzheimer's didn't show up in the literature until 1911. Autism, 1940.
What about this obesity epidemic?
What about it? Every 10% we spend on technology, obesity goes up 1% in the NHANES data. Guess why? Leptin, melanocortin pathway. Jack Cruz is afflicted. My friend Rick Rubin afflicted.
I mean, every time I hear about the obesity epidemic or a suicide, I point to the fact
it's blue light.
Circadian rhythms are messed up.
Well, guess what? Blue light destroys melatonin and DHA in the central retinal pathway to start this process off, which is part of the reason why I came here, because I'm mad at you when you told people, don't worry about glasses, don't worry about contacts.
Wait, so you're telling me,
stop.
I'll correct the record for sure, but I want to make sure that I get it right. So contacts makes perfect sense to me based on the oxygenation issue. You don't want to cap the front of the eye.
Tell the audience the why. Because remember, the cornea is translucent. It has no blood vessels in it. Mm-hmm. So how does it get oxygen? Straight from the air.
Right, so you don't want to cover it in a
no way.
In a plastic bag.
When you cover oxygen, what do? You change
suffocating it. Yeah.
Well, not only that. That's a good way to understand it. I want you to go deeper. When you're done with me today, Jack, we narrowed the wideband semiconductor so it can't make enough UV light distal in the system. That's the real answer. Changing oxygen tension alone. Do you remember when you posted something on Twitter and I went ballistic on
Which time?
About fluoride.
Oh, yeah.
And you remember why I said it? Because fluoride is more electronegative than oxygen. So when you put fluoride in anything, what are you effectively doing? You're stealing electrons.
You'll like, then in that case, though, you will like the water episode because I go after fluoride with a vengeance. Because there are now data saying that like fluoride at what most people consider trivial levels are severely impairing thyroid hormone function.
Of course they are.
I know people are going to accuse me of being a wacko, but when you look at the data, it's just blatant.
No, the world is fucked up.
You're
finding the truth, but you want to know why? Until today, you didn't know anything about iodine, semiconduction, and that iodine improves wideband semiconduction. And what did I tell you before about the periodic table? 1 to 53. 53 is iodine. Why the hell would nature use a group 7 halogen? Because its atomic mass is so big, it needs its electrons, but it brings protons closer together. It allows us to proton tunnel. And what are we? We are the mammal that has the most massive Ferrari engine in our head. And it turns out iodine is really important. I always tell people what the thyroid is. You make thyroid hormone, in case you don't know, T3 and T4 from tyrosine. Oh, we're back to that story again. 200 to 400 nanometer light. So you make it from light. But here's the craziest part of the story. The numbers in T3 and T4 stand for iodine. So what do I always tell my mitochondriacs when they're not scientific people? In a car, your mitochondria is the engine. You know what your thyroid is? The gas pedal. When you have hypothyroidism, you got a stuck gas pedal. You can only go through LA traffic at 20 miles an hour. That's what hypothyroidism is.
Yeah, the effects of fluoride on the thyroid are striking. So for filtering water, I know that you're a proponent of reverse osmosis water.
Yeah, but I'll tell you the filters. You know, Berkey is the big one that always talks about fluoride and getting it out. I did hacks on them. They're full of shit. I just got to say that because it's just not cool.
What filters work for getting fluoride out?
You can't get fluoride out. The only thing you can do is you overwhelm the system with iodine. So I told people in a podcast, I used to have fluorosis on my anterior incisor. I used to be a dentist, and I asked everybody in dental school about this. And of course, I got all centralized answers. Then when I got smarter and I started going through my weight loss, I'm like, you know what? Part of my prescription is seafood because of the DHA, but iodine is huge there. So what I found out is the more seafood I ate, the more seaweed I ate, the fluorosis went away. So the same thing is true. And when I'm a spine surgeon, when I do surgery, I can see fluorosis in the bone as well. So when I see that and I'm operating on somebody, immediately, as soon as they wake up, I'm like, you're going to change what you're doing. Like we're going to talk about. The number one way people get poisoned with fluoride today isn't what they think. It used to be water. Now it's big pharma. You want to take a look at any single pharmaceutical that is dealing with frontal lobe disease, mental illness, almost all of them have fluoride in it. The other interesting thing that I've pointed out to my anesthesiologist who put people to sleep, the older general inhalation drugs like halothane, all fluoridated hydrocarbons.
I've used halothane in a lab. That is nasty stuff.
Right. But just so you know, me and her grew up using halothane.
We use isoflurane now. Is it terrible?
Think about what you just said.
Yeah.
But that's what I want to explain to you. When you understand how this works, like, look, you use this stuff, but you realize that CRNAs who work with us, those are certified registered nurses that help the anesthesiologist out. Do you know that when they go in a room, you have to measure how much gas around them because they abort their fetuses. So if you're aborting the fetus and you know that the womb is controlled by leptin, fecundity in humans is controlled by the hormone leptin.
Yeah, I think leptin flips on puberty in females.
Correct. Exactly correct. So when you know this and you're putting people in these chemicals, like I'm talking toothpaste, hair dyes, the dentist with the fluoride stuff. I mean, holy shit. And you got to remember, I'm a former dentist.
When I was a kid,
fluoride has no role for human health. It's a toxin.
When I was a kid, I went to the dentist. I had, it was an old school thing. So they put me in front of a cartoon and they'd put these little trays around my teeth and soak my teeth in fluoride. And I hated it. So what did I do? I gulped it down, thinking this was going to be
that explains everything.
Puked everywhere, right? And that's when I realized this stuff is super toxic.
Yeah.
Super toxic.
They did that to me one time, and then I never went back to the dentist.
I wish my parents had done that. I hated it.
So Chantal just handed me a piece of paper. This one's a good one. I'm glad you said this. So you were talking about light stability before. So I did a podcast. I forget who it was, but the Somalis, we have Somalis that come to the United States here in about the last 20, 25 years because they have, civil war in their country in Africa. So the largest population is in the Detroit area. So that's about 44th latitude. So in Somalia, if you talk to them, they have no word for autism. In the United States, they developed the word because they have the highest rates of autism there. So remember, the human cradle, where we believe we went from chimp to human. I know I'm offending people who believe in evolution. I should say in God, but that's fine. In the East African Rift, that's where 3 tectonic plates came together. That's the cradle of human life, according to the fossil record that we have. Somalia is really close to that. And these people, when you look at their skin, they got melanin big time. So that means that they can stay in sunlight for a really long time. You ever been to Detroit lately? Not a lot of sun. A lot different than the East African Rift. So I want you to think about what I said with melanin in them. They're losing the melanin inside their head. What does that do to the germinal matrix in the babies that are coming? Starting to see the connection there. So, when I talk to people about, brain stuff, they kind of pay attention to me because they know I'm a neurosurgeon, but they're like, yeah, but autism is not a neurosurgeon's disease. Well, guess what? It's not a neurosurgical disease, but when you know how to treat people with brain surgery without a scalpel, I think it's in my wheelhouse.
Is there evidence that putting kids with autism into more regular circadian cycles can benefit them?
Absolutely.
I mean, my sense is the answer has to be yes, because you benefit every biological system that way.
Do you know the story of Temple Grandin?
Yes.
Okay, so guess what? This goes to Rick's point. Remember when we talked before about taking the headphones off and letting the bass sounds go through you? Have you ever found it weird as a scientist that just putting cows through a tight space makes them easier to slaughter? And it turns out when you constrain an autistic kid, the same thing happens. Do you know why?
You mean not easier to slaughter? You mean the kid becomes more docile?
Well, I'm talking about the kid becomes controllable.
Right.
But the same thing with the animal.
Right.
Do you know why? Hydrogen bonding network changes in water and actually makes them more quantum coherent.
That's like swaddling babies as well.
You got it. So it goes back to Rick's discussion of the book. Remember, no science. Rick's got to get, I want Rick to know what's in that book. There's some Jack Cruz in that book. I want him to know these observations that he made, these are powerful. When I read stuff in his book, when he opens that up and sees what I wrote, he's going to go, son of a bitch. I want him to know the science because you know what? He is known as an artist. I want him to be a scientist. I'm known as a scientist. I'm trying to embrace the art. That's the reason we come together. That's the reason why you decide whether you like somebody or not. Everybody has had the experience when you meet somebody, you're like, oh, this guy's an asshole. I don't want any part of him. And other people, you're just like, I don't know what it is about that guy, but I want to go out to dinner with him. I want to have a glass of wine with him. You know, I'd like to talk to him about something else. It's kind of like what you said before when you met Rick. You started telling him about your personal problems. There was something about Rick where you felt that you could communicate. And I think the reason you liked his book so much actually is tied to that reason. That is quantum coherence. That is water chemistry. You, all your protein semiconductors in you, sense that. You are a photomultiplier, my friend. You just don't know it. I'm that dude. Remember I told you, visible coach that explains the magics that he talks about.
There's a story I wanted to share related to something you said about the Institute for the Advancement of Human Potential, which is a place in Pennsylvania where they treat brain-injured kids. And they have a success rate of kids who are born blind. They have a 90% success rate of getting kids who are born blind to be able to see with no drug therapy, just through physical therapy and movement patterns. And there's something that we found through the brain injuries that was, there was a moral dilemma. Because some of these kids, brain-injured kids, had some special gifts, like a virtuoso violinist, incredible painter. And when their brains were repaired, those gifts went away.
That's the semi-connection story. You just described.
But what's the right thing to do? It's like, what's more valuable? Do we want another
What do you value?
normal drone, or do you want a Picasso?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I tell you the story. When you were saying this, I smiled. I pointed at Chantel because I taught her this. She didn't know about it. So, and I know you've heard this. You know that there's a lot of people who are sexual deviants that have foot fetishes. Do you know why?
Is it? I always thought that fetishes relate to the fact that most of the fetishes are not for random things, but for things that are potentially infectious, like dead bodies, feces, feet, etc.
You ever look at the homunculus on the brain?
Yes.
What's the feet next to?
The genitals. Yeah, so the homunculus is the representation of the body in the brain, and so the highest density of the map is far bigger for the genitals and feet than it is for anything else.
So guess what? What happens is when the wideband semiconductor changes, just what happened with Eddie Chang and the tumor, same thing can happen with your feet. When it happens, the person has much more sensitive feet and it acts more like a sexual organ.
I think Ramachandran, the neurologist, talked about people who had their foot amputated and they would then experience orgasm in their phantom foot.
Correct.
Because of plasticity in the brain.
Well, I mean, his story on mirrors and stuff is absolutely, listen, those are the things for a neurosurgeon like me who sees the science and the art. This tells you the mysteries of the brain are within. We need things like that to really make us curious.
Rick will love this because he loves magic. So Ramachandra did these incredible experiments. People who have a amputation will often have a phantom limb, and it's in pain or in a position that's uncomfortable for them. So he created these mirror boxes where they would put their hand in, and they'd move their hand, but they had to look at the mirror, and they would see a reflection of what appeared to be the hand that they don't have a hand, but it looked like they did, and they would feel the hand relaxing, and then they could put it into a position or in their pocket they were comfortable with, purely by visual perception. So in a way, it's using what we sometimes call magic, but visual illusion to completely rewire the nervous system in real time.
I had that experience with...
But isn't that what I just told you about melanin? That mammals had that ability in neuroectoderm. Isn't that still the story I told you about Becker and limb amputation? See, you need to see something that's already published and say, God, this makes total sense now. So you're not shocked by it. You're like, what are the implications?
Well, you offered a mechanism.
Correct.
When I used virtual reality glasses, I've been in experiences where I get very nauseous based on the experience. But if you close your eyes, it stops. Right away. Right away. If you're seeing it, you feel the nausea. If you close your eyes, it goes away.
And that's, just so you know, that's mitigated through the vagus nerve. And one of the parts of the vagus nerve doesn't have a blood-brain barrier. But it goes back to the point I made earlier that most of your cortex in your brain is visual. Most of the wiring, we are creatures of light. It's so difficult for people to accept. It's not difficult for you to accept because I think functionally you get it. But I didn't know if you knew about the science of hearing, about why is the cochlea shaped as a seashell that you find on the shore? Why does it have melanin in it? Because you actually use light to hear. That's the key. And then that light is transmitted to a DC electric current that goes through your eighth nerve. And then there's a somatotopic organization in the auditory cortex, in Wernicke's area, all the things that Huberman likes to talk about. But there's nuances. Like we were just talking at lunchtime about kids. I'm starting to see this very unusual. When I say kids, I'm talking 25 and below. People that use the Apple iPod in their ear, whatever you call them, AirPods, EarPods. Well, they're starting to get many more cases of both hearing loss, tinnitus, and this new diagnosis called, I'm going to probably butcher the name, misanthropia. And it's not got a DSM classification yet, in medicine. But this is what it's like, because I'm sure there's probably some people who are going to listen to this go, damn, I may have this. It's where you develop like horrible sensations from sounds.
Yeah.
It's almost like a synesthesia that you get, but we're seeing it much more frequently in kids who are using these devices. And the reason why this is a big deal, and I think you know this, Rick, humans don't have myelinated cortexes, meaning the fat around the nerves, until you're 25 years old. This is the reason why you can't rent a car or a hotel room until your orbital frontal cortex is wired, because it protects you from electromagnetic, pollution. The frontal lobes are the last thing that usually wires, usually the base of the frontal lobes. So that's why people who are teenagers tend to do crazy things, at that part of their life. The big thing is, though, when you're not myelinated, you need to realize as a clinician that these kids' melanin semiconductors are at risk huge. Now, the one good thing about melanin, it even absorbs all the way up to gamma level radiation. The problem becomes the way in which we use it. Water is always adjacent to where melanin is. And water does have a limit to what it can do. And what happens is those melanin semiconductors in your ear degrade. And if it's not recognized by the ENT doctor or the pediatrician, what can happen is these kids can go from a very unusual hearing problem to a mental issue. And many of the things that we're seeing, like one of the big changes I've seen in my career in neurosurgery, suicide was never really a problem in the below 20 crowd or the below 15 crowd. Now it's like commonplace. And I've seen it. I've also seen probably the big thing in my world is carotid disease in kids that are really young. And this kind of is linked to your issue. The reason why is we didn't know that melanopsin was in blood vessels. So if you think about where you put the cell phone, it's right next to your carotid. If you think about screens, it's usually in front of your face. So we're seeing lesions and we can't explain them. Like you talk to a vascular surgeon and you just ask them a question. And then I usually tell the vascular surgeons, do you ask your patients if they have pets? And they look at me like, why are you asking about a pet? I said, you'll find out if you ask doctors in a community what diseases their patients have, you'll find out the pets have the same disease. So guess what? This story is big. It's teaching you that some of the same programs are built into our animals. They don't have the epigenetic toolbox in order to tolerate, the signal to noise ratio. But even within the human species, kids are much different because their neurologic systems are completely different than the adult form. And the thing is, when you realize that in the last 20 years, you and I probably know this better than he does, but the way we grew up and the way kids are growing up now, in terms of the technology use, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I kind of spanned the transition because I'm 47. So it was like internet came in, email came in while I was in college. But, I didn't play video games, still don't.
Yeah.
But kids now, I mean, it's unbelievable.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, so much screen time.
Tell me about the, considering the fact that there are all of these, there are some of these environmental factors that we can control. We could move to a better place. We could get rid of our smart meters. We could not carry devices with us. What are the things that we can do beyond what we take away that strengthens our ability to deal with these stressors? Like, what do you do to be able to go into surgery?
Yeah, I would tell you, my answer may surprise you. I think the number one thing that I would like to see do, not to be hyperbolic, but what I'm going to say, I truly believe, but I know this is going to not resonate with some part of your audience. I believe we're in a sixth extinction event, just like the KT event right now. And we're going through cognitive de-evolution. I think the biggest change I'd like to see is parents have to stop letting their kids use technology as a digital babysitter. I view the use of technology in an unmyelinated brain the same way you and I would probably look at a kid in 1970s being pulled into a Walmart and get his ass kicked by his father. It's absolute child abuse. That's how I feel about it. That is an epidemic in parenting. And the parents, most of them are low dopamine to begin with, so they can't deal with the kid. So the technology helps quiet the kid down, but effectively what you're doing is you're dumbing the kid down. You're making him a low dopamine, low melatonin, and you're disturbing the water. The nice thing about kids, the one protection they do have when they don't have the melanin, when a child is born, they're 80% water. You and I right now, we're probably about 55, 60%. So that's a built-in protection because water acts like a Faraday cage. Melanin is the real Faraday cage. But remember, we don't have a ton of that on the outside. We do, but not the melanin like we have inside our head. Neuromelanin is different than the melanin we have on our skin. Even African Americans are dark, like the Somalis we talked about. That melanin isn't as dark as the melanin that's in the substantia nigra or in the locus ceruleus.
Should we start tomorrow talking about water? Would that be a good deep dive tomorrow to start with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm eating this up, by the way, and I feel like we're transitioning a bit to sort of practicals in some ways. We'll transition back to other things too.
Yeah.
I want to make sure at some point tomorrow we talk about cytochrome. I want to make sure I understand cytochrome.
What's the mouth of every cytochrome?
What's that?
What's in the mouth of every cytochrome?
What's in the mouth of
iron and sulfur. What did I just tell you about the periodic table?
Magnetism? No.
It's a semiconductor. Remember, it's doped. Iron is doped by sulfur.
Now all I see in my mind's eye are like these waves of chromophores in us,
cephalopod.
like the cuttlefish.
You're a cephalopod. But look, when you said that, I have to tell you that Rick said there's going to be a moment where you're going to realize it was wise for you to come. That was my moment with you, because you may disagree with a lot of what I said, but you got it when you made that comment.
I don't think he disagreed with anything you said.
One thing, I don't know if this is meaningful for you or for the audience, but I'll just say it anyway. I think I wasn't completely forthcoming. What I think helped Rick and I resonate early on, at least for me, was I grew up in the punk rock thing, and I knew that he knew Joe Strummer, so I wanted stories about Joe, and he gave me a few stories, and then I realized that, and Rick said when we were trying to build our podcast studio, he was like, well, his words, I came up in punk rock, so I want to keep things small and a particular feel. For me, feel is everything. It's what guided my choices of what to experiment on. Of course, it's not how I guide my interpretation of the data, because the data are the data, as you know. But for me, it's always been like, who are the people looking at things differently? So I'm not disagreeing at all. I'm dazzled and delighted. And to me, like, I don't know a ton of physics. I know some, so I have a lot to learn. But I know that this idea about melanin being the screen, and the idea that our cells emit light, and the idea in my mind now, this image of waves of light or flashes of light. We don't know what the organization is,
None of us do, because we don't have photomultipliers yet.
Exactly.
To do it.
And all I want to do is see it. And so, but I can see it in my mind's eye.
But remember something, the guys that you train from this day forward, just the fact that you can get up in front of a room full of medical students and say, look, I don't know if this is true, but I think there's a possibility that we all have a cuttlefish in our brain, and that one of you may win a Nobel Prize someday for finding it. If you do that, you will do what St. George did for Becker. The 1941 speech that he gave about his Nobel Prize is he just said to his students, Becker was a medical student at the time, he goes, I think proteins are semiconductors. That's all he said. And look what Becker did with it. 25 years later, proved it in bone. Now look where we are, 35 years later, and we're still talking about that modern science still doesn't understand what Becker found. And the implications, Eddie Chang-wise, incalculable.
Yeah, incalculable. To be continued.
Love it.